commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Okay, go ahead.
For the record, Shantona Chaudhry for the commission. Our next witness is Ms. Jody Thomas, the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. I would ask the witness be sworn or affirmed.
Ms. Thomas, will you swear on a religious document or do you wish to affirm?
On a religious document, please.
We have the Bible, the Quran, or the Torah available.
The Bible, please.
For the record, please state your full name and spell it out.
Jody Hazel Thomas, Thomas.
Do you swear that the evidence to be given by you to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Ms. Thomas. Thank you for being here. We'll just start with a couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, you'll recall participating in an interview with Commission Counsel on August 30th of this year.
I do.
Okay. And you'll recall that some of your colleagues who are not here today, namely Assistant Secretary Michael McDonald and Assistant Secretary Martin Green, also participated in that interview.
That's correct.
Okay. And after that interview, Commission Counsel prepared a summary of the interview. And for the record, I don't think we need to pull it up, Mr. Clerk, but for the record, it's WTS 5071. So, Ms. Thomas, I'll just ask you to confirm that you've reviewed that interview summary and that it's accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief, and that insofar as it contains the information of your colleagues, they have also reviewed it and confirmed it is accurate.
That's correct.
Okay. And the second little housekeeping matter is the institutional report of the Privy Council Office, affectionately known as the PCO. So you're aware that the PCO filed an institutional report with the Commission,
I am.
and you've reviewed it,
I have.
and it's accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Okay. For the record, that's DOJ IR 6013. Ms. Thomas, I'll ask you to just start by telling the Commission what is the role of the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister?
So the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister is a position that was created after 9/11 in order to coordinate and bring sort of structure to the national security community, which is a group of very independent departments with independent deputy heads, although they all work together in a horizontal manner. And what was learned after 9/11 was that coordination amongst these departments and agencies is useful in understanding intelligence, national security, and foreign policy issues. And so in my job, what I do is I do coordinate the national security community. I have a convening function, which means I can call them to meetings, I can raise questions, challenge them on certain issues. So I have a challenge function like all deputy secretaries at the Privy Council office. And I also provide advice and information and brief the Prime Minister of Canada.
Okay. And when you speak of the national security community and the various departments and agencies, who are you speaking of specifically?
The Department of National Defence, Global Affairs Canada, Public Safety and its agencies, CBSA, CSIS, RCMP, and the Canadian Security Establishment, the Communication Security Establishment known as CSE. Those are the primary players.
Okay. And within the Secretariat, well, I believe there's four separate secretariats, or 3 or 4 secretariats that were within the National Security and Intelligence Advisory. Can you tell us about those?
That's correct. There are 4 secretariats. So the newest is the Emergency Management Secretariat, and it was created in November 2021. And then the Foreign Policy and Defense Advisor to the Prime Minister reports through me. The Assistant Secretary for Intelligence Assessment, which is Martin Green, and then the Security and Intelligence Secretariat, which is the job done by, led by Mike McDonald,
Okay, so they all report to you, and you in turn report to who?
the Prime Minister and the clerk.
And the clerk of the Privy Council. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the communication channels there? So you report directly to the Prime Minister. What's the briefing method? What's the reporting relationship there?
So any written brief or advice that goes to the Prime Minister goes through the clerk. I sign it off as the National Security Advisor, but she also reviews it and signs it before it goes to the Prime Minister. Verbal briefs, cabinet briefs, discussions with the Prime Minister, the clerk is in the room normally, and she's certainly aware of what I'm discussing with the Prime Minister. I don't call him directly. I haven't had to in the environment that we have been existing in. Generally, the conversation, anything I need to get to him, I go through PMO or through the clerk.
Okay. And I understand that you assume the role of National Security and Intelligence Advisor. I'm going to say NSIA. We all hate acronyms, but that's a mouthful. Shortly before the events of the Freedom Convoy, is that right?
I became the NSIA on January 11th, 2022.
And where were you before then?
I was the Deputy Minister of National Defence.
How long had you been in that role?
Since November 2017.
Okay. And what was your background before that?
I was the Commissioner of the Canadian Coast Guard, then the Deputy Commissioner of the Coast Guard. So I've had 35 years of experience in the federal government.
So you mentioned that you have a convening role between all of these various agencies, the national security community, as you call them. We heard earlier this week from your colleagues at Public Safety, and they described their role as being a consumer of intelligence as opposed to a collector of intelligence. I understand the same is true of PCO.
Yes, that's correct.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Where the sources of your intelligence come from?
The sources of intelligence from covert and overt, so open source, but also what's collected by the agencies, comes from CSIS, RCMP, CSE, Global Affairs Canada, and the Foreign Intelligence Secretariat, and Canadian Forces Intelligence Command as the primary domestic agencies. We also hear from our Five Eyes colleagues. So we hear from we get intelligence that we read and consume and analyze, assess from Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and the US. We also receive open source and review open source information from academics. We look at social media to some extent, not as much as we should. We do about certain incidents, but we don't do social media scraping as an example, and that will later become an issue that we talk about. So primarily the information, the intelligence we receive domestically, but we have links around the world.
Okay, and if I can ask it colloquially, when you get it, what do you do with it?
So I read raw intelligence, but the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat assesses it. It looks at trends. It looks at implications for Canada. What if intelligence is actionable, meaning we receive a piece of intelligence that says something could happen. What do we do with that? They do that kind of assessment, reaching out back to those departments to ensure that there is a global view of what this intelligence means for Canada and for our allies.
And do they produce like assessments, certain products of intelligence? And if so, how are those disseminated, dispersed? What's done with them?
They do multiple kinds of products. They do longer term vision products about we see a trend coming. They do a daily foreign intelligence brief, which is a document that is sent to a reading list of people around various departments and within PCO. They do an update once a week to the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's foreign intelligence update. They will do bespoke products on specific situations. We had, for example, this week, an incident in Ukraine where there was a missile shot down in Poland. So they did a bespoke piece on that to analyze it very quickly in conjunction with the rest of the security agencies, primarily D&D in this case.
Okay, with that basic background out of the way, we'll move now to the events of January and February 2022. So the first thing I want to ask you about is the early monitoring of the convoy. And I'll ask Mr. Clerk if you can pull up ssm.nsc.can 403209. So this is an email from Mike McDonald, who we understand to be Assistant Secretary of Security and Intelligence, to you, Jacqueline Bogdan, who is Deputy Secretary, Emergency Preparedness, and a variety of people. So to situate you in time, this is Tuesday, January 22nd, so ahead of the arrival of the convoy. So I'm going to take you through a couple of points in this email. If we can just scroll down a little bit, Mr. Clerk. Okay, just a little bit more. Here we go, thank you. So at this point, in monitoring the convoy thus far, the RCMP and other law enforcement report that it is peaceful, participants are being lawful and disciplined as they have an objective of arriving in Ottawa on time as planned. While the current convoy is peaceful, concern lies around whether any individuals might join the convoy who are not aligned with peaceful protest. And then there's some media reporting, YouTube videos, and some comparison to some people who might like to see a January 6th Capitol Hill type event. Just scroll to the next page, please. And we see there's some talk of social media, content targeting some ministers around the bottom of the page there. And then, sorry, keep scrolling a little bit, Mr. Clerk. Here we go. Then there's CSIS has received media queries lately about the convoy and CSIS's role in any monitoring activities. And there's a bullet here where Mr. McDonald says, this is a sensitive area for CSIS, as the CSIS Act defines that CSIS cannot interpret lawful advocacy, protest, or dissent as threats to the security of Canada, unless it is in conjunction with defined threat activity to the security of Canada, as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act. For example, espionage, sabotage, FI, I think it's foreign interference, serious violence, destruction or overthrow by violence of a constitutionally established system of government. Can you explain what Mr. McDonald was referring to when he said this is a sensitive area for CSIS?
So what he is referring to is that with the media reporting that there were probably some people who had other than peaceful intentions, what was CSIS going to do about that? And CSIS cannot surveil a lawful protest. Now, if there are individuals who are subjects of theirs investigations, in that they can monitor the activities of those individuals, but they cannot scan, surveil, watch a protest anticipating violence, looking for subjects to follow. Peaceful protests are not part of their mandate.
Okay, and I think we'll probably hear more from CSIS themselves when they testify on Monday, but would it be fair to say that meant that there was limited information on the convoy coming into you from CSIS?
Absolutely.
Okay. Then the next thing Mr. McDonald talks about, Mr. Clerk, if you just scroll down, back a little bit, outstanding questions. So these are some questions that were flagged as issues that you might have to deal with over the period of the convoy, whatever that was then going to be. Who has authority to pay attention to the online space and chatter? Threats to parliamentarians. Are other ministers, opposition leaders, or parliamentarians under similar threats? What would engagement look like? Should MPs meet with the convoy while in Ottawa? Is this safe? And do we have advice for them? What will be the specific advice to ministers on this issue? And I assume that's talking about meeting with members of the convoy. And then if we scroll down a little bit more, there's the talk of potential, does CAF is Canadian Armed Forces, or JTF2, what does JTF2 stand for?
Joint Task Force 2. So Special Forces.
Special Forces have a possible role. Okay, so it's fair to say that those were issues flagged by Mr. McDonald as things that PCO would and the government would have to think about.
Flagged within the ADM NSOPS working group, I would suggest, rather than just Mr. McDonald.
Fair enough. Okay. And I think we'll probably come back to some of those issues as we go through the chronology a little bit. Okay, Mr. Clerk, if you can now pull up SSM NSC CAN 50250. This will be another email sent on January 25th, and I understand you're not actually a recipient of this email personally. It was to Mr. McDonald, but I'm hoping you can help us with some of the issues in there. Specifically, Mr. Clerk, if you can scroll down to page 3 to a point where you see there is a gap where it comes to reporting. There we go. So this is our deputy minister. So this is Derek Traherne from Public Safety writing. I'm sorry, it's not Derek Traherne writing, but in any event, it's to Derek Traherne. Our deputy minister, Rob, debriefed on the NSIA call on this topic today and mentioned that there is a gap where it comes to reporting on this issue as we head towards the demonstration this weekend. Do you know what reporting gap Mr. Stewart was talking about there?
I would think that he is talking about information from law enforcement on what their planned actions are going to be. I mean, we don't expect to be pre-briefed on what they're going to do. We don't get into tactical plans, but the reporting out of the activity on the Hill, how is that going to happen or in the protest?
Okay, so this is a law enforcement reporting gap?
That's what I think reading this.
Okay, so that is actually an issue that we discussed a little bit in your interview. Can you tell us, can you explain to the commission what that gap is? It's something that's been identified here by Mr. Stewart, and it was also identified in his testimony. As I said, it was discussed also in your interview. So can you elaborate on what that law enforcement reporting gap was from your point of view?
So there is a general gap in terms of open source information and who can collect it, who can analyze it, and what we do with it. RCMP collects information for law enforcement purposes, and as do other police agencies. We've all heard of Op-Hendon now. I don't receive Op-Hendon reports, as an example. And so the police forces collectively have a lot of information that they can't necessarily share. And so those of us in jobs like mine and Deputy Minister Stewart's who need some overview of what's coming, who these people are, what their intentions are, have a difficulty in receiving that kind of open source information.
And did you identify that as an issue that reoccurred throughout the events of the convoy?
Absolutely, it was an issue. The online space is where planning now occurs. And so it's not tapping phones any longer the way things were done in the Cold War. Online space, non-warranted space, and how do you receive, assess, and then use that information in a legal manner?
So with that having been said, what was your expectation of what the convoy was going to look like when it arrived in Ottawa?
So Ottawa is the city of protests. That's been said. It's known. The OPS is experienced in collaborating with all the various other agencies involved in terms of managing protests. The early reporting was that this would be a normal protest. Arrive, disrupt, spend some time here in Ottawa, and then leave. We were seeing just on Twitter feeds, your own Twitter feed, indications that perhaps this was going to be something more. But the information we had at that point in time from the accountable agencies was that they had it managed, and it was going to be big, it was going to be complex, but they would be able to handle it in the way they have handled so many other protests.
So were any specific steps taken by PCO or by you ahead of the convoy's arrival to prepare for it?
Well, Intersect, which is the grouping that you've heard about of all the police agencies in Ottawa, was certainly stood up and was operating. Employees were told to stay home over the weekend. Don't come to the office if you can avoid coming downtown. We set up reporting mechanisms, and we arranged to brief ministers on what we knew and what was going on over the course of the weekend.
And then, as we know, the convoy arrived and didn't leave when it was expected to do. So what was the response from your perspective then?
So the original response, every day, the question was, when is this going to end? What are we doing to end it? There's absolutely no doubt that having it end was the priority. In the immediate, there seemed to be quite a bit of activity between OPS and RCMP to understand the magnitude of this. At the same time, after the first weekend, we saw behavior on the streets that indicated they were settling in for quite some time. You know, wheels were removed from rigs so that they couldn't be towed. Supply lines were being set up. And so something quite different was happening and unfolding in front of our eyes.
And within the federal government, the response, you mentioned earlier the ADMNS Ops, which is the Assistant Deputy Minister, National Security Operations Committee, and that's co-chaired by Mike MacDonald?
Mike MacDonald and Don Rochon at the time.
Okay, and so we've heard already that that committee was meeting daily as an information sharing mechanism?
That's right, and DMOC was meeting, DMOC, you've heard a lot about it, it was meeting informally. We made it a standing meeting every day at the same time, but we were checking in to see what we knew and what could be done to end this protest every day, and we were briefing ministers.
And DMOC was chaired by you?
Yes.
Is DMOC always chaired by you, or was that specific to this circumstance because it was a security thing?
As long as it has existed, it's been chaired by the National Security Advisor.
Okay. What other kind of meetings were you participating in?
That's the majority of it. So with deputy ministers, hearing what the ADMs were doing, and then the law enforcement meetings were going on in parallel. And certainly Op Intersect was meeting in parallel.
And what about with the externally to the federal government? Were you participating in meetings that involved other authorities, municipal, provincial?
Not in the first weekend, not until the first meeting with the city.
And when was that, in your recollection?
I don't have the date in front of me, but we have the information available. So it was the first meeting that Rob Stewart called. I had asked, I'm new in the job, we're meeting every day to understand what we can do, what action can be taken, who has what authority. And I asked if I can call the city. What is my role vis-a-vis the city being a federal authority? Discussed it with Deputy Minister Stewart because he has the federal policing responsibility and that secretariat works for him. It was decided he would do the reach out to the city. And that's how we had our first meeting with the city manager and Chief Slowly.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can you pull up ONT 50159? So this is a summary of a call that was held with the city, the federal government, and the provincial government on February 6th. This may be the first meeting that you were talking about. It may be the second.
Second, I would say.
Offhand. Pardon
Second.
me? It's the second. Okay. So I want to ask you about something specific in this meeting, which if we scroll down to page 9 of the PDF, I believe. So in evidence that we've heard before the commission, we've been through most of this already. There's one specific point having to do with you. It notes at the end here that you noted it was a positive meeting, regrets to end on this following point. But would the province be looking to the federal government if this protest was happening outside the city of Ottawa, for example, happening in other places like Kingston? So Mr. Mario Di Tommaso, Deputy Solicitor General, testified here a couple of weeks ago, I'm sorry. And his impression of that comment was that this was the federal government trying to wash its hands of this entire thing. So now that we have you before us, I wanted to ask you, is that what you intended by that comment?
Absolutely not. From where we sat, that all three levels of government needed to be involved. And the federal government was very involved. The RCMP was meeting constantly with the Ottawa Police Service. We were working to understand what the context and the elements of the people on the streets of Ottawa were and what they intended to do. So that was the intelligence side of things. We were looking at what federal acts and authorities could be used to have the rigs moved and the truckers leave downtown Ottawa. And we wanted to know what provincial laws could be used and would be enforced to ensure we could clear the streets. Mr. Di Tommaso, his answer was, well, it's a federal jurisdiction. Ottawa is a city in Ontario. And the provincial accountability is the same for Ottawa, except for a very small precinct on Parliament Hill. But where the majority of the protests were is a municipality. And so I found that Mr. Di Tommaso, well, friendly and cooperative, was very hands-off. And I didn't understand why. And I wanted to make the point that we're not Washington, D.C. Ottawa is a municipality of Ontario. And so very simple things like the Ontario Police Services Act, which requires the Ottawa Police Service to go to the OPP for additional resources, were additional resources going to be provided to Ottawa to assist?
Thank you for that. So I'm now going to skip ahead a little bit and talk about your role in briefing cabinet committees and cabinet itself in all of this. So the first thing is, and this is in reference to something that you said in your interview and something that's also said in the institutional report, and I want to clarify what it means with the commission. In the interview, you explained that your role at the IRG meetings and anytime you were briefing cabinet was to provide a full and frank factual threat picture to cabinet or to the IRG. And again, then in the institutional report, it says, I don't think we need to turn it up, but the briefings that you gave did not include advice or recommendations. So can you flesh that out a little bit and explain what you were and what you weren't doing and maybe why?
So without betraying what was said at the meetings, my role was to give an overview of the situation nation to nation, like coast to coast, the entire nation. As we were moving into having blockades at border crossings, pop-up convoys across the country, as well as the situation in Ottawa, I gave a consolidated view of what was happening across the country, what we were seeing in terms of manifestation, intelligence that said there were going to be new convoys or maybe there weren't, what we saw from ceases on the IMDE, the ideologically motivated extremist front, any arrests, those kinds of high-level details that gave framed the discussion that the Prime Minister was going to have with other officials and his cabinet ministers. And so did I give advice? No, I gave overview. In the discussion, if required, I would make suggestions as all officials do at those meetings at IRGs, but my overview and my opening remarks were not advice.
Okay. And at some point it says that you would sometimes be asked to give or provide your assessment of a situation. So can you explain the distinction then between an assessment of a situation and advice?
Advice is, so assessment is, Prime Minister, we think that they are going to stay in Ottawa for another weekend. Looking at all the indicators, the assessment is, and that's a very simplistic example, but advice is the RCMP should move in right now and take it over and clean up the streets of Ottawa. That would be advice. Again, I'm giving you a very extreme example of something that was not said.
That's helpful. Simple is good. Simple is always good. Okay. So I'd like to turn now to some examples of the actual briefings that you were giving at these various meetings. So Mr. Clerk, if you could pull up SSM NSC CAN 50292. While you're pulling that up, I'll just explain. This is the SSE meeting of February 3rd. And can you just give the commission a brief reminder of what SSE is?
SSE is a standing committee of cabinet chaired by Minister Blair, and it's the Safety, Security, and Emergency Management Committee.
Okay. If we can just go to paragraph 4, please, Mr. Clerk. There doesn't seem to be a paragraph 4. Oh, there we go. Yeah, thank you. It's paragraph 4 of a different thing. Sorry about that. The National Security and Intelligence Advisor, NSIA, indicated that protest organizers have indicated an interest, sorry, I should slow down, I know that, indicated an interest in negotiation. However, the protesters confirmed that representatives from the city, province, or federal government have not reached out. So this is February 3rd at this point, and you're indicating that the protest organizers have indicated an interest in negotiation. Where did that information come from? What were you talking about there?
Open source. They were saying it themselves. They had news conferences, and they were putting out their own media indicating that they would sit down with representatives.
Okay. And then you said the protesters confirmed that representatives from the city, province, or federal government have not reached out. Was this also just from open source media? So this wasn't from any particular information you had, just collating open source information. Okay. Mr. Clerk, next one is ssm.nsc.can 50246. Okay, these aren't minutes of a meeting, they're talking points. So do I understand that these would be materials prepared for you by your staff in preparation for one of these meetings?
That's correct.
Okay. We go to page 3, please. There we go, the bullet that says senior officials. So senior officials, Deputy Ministers Stewart, Keenan, and myself continue to engage the City of Ottawa to encourage dialogue with demonstrators, consultations with provincial regulatory authorities, sharing of operational plans, and a coherent communications approach. And I see encourage dialogue as bolded and underlined there. So what was that about? What were you talking about there, dialoguing with the protesters?
Some of it was the work that was already being done by the PLTs, and so it was to introduce that discussion and that line of work that was being done by OPS with the demonstrators. And we were hearing that engagement would be welcomed. It wasn't yet defined. We didn't have a plan for it. We didn't even know what it would look like, but we're just reporting what we're being told. And we're hearing that from the City of Ottawa primarily.
Okay, but what it says there is that Deputy Minister Stewart, Deputy Minister Keenan, and you are engaging the City of Ottawa to encourage dialogue. So at that point, were you actively encouraging?
For the city to talk to them, yes, because this was happening in the City of Ottawa.
Okay. In the hope then that dialoguing with the demonstrators would produce a positive outcome.
Exactly. Reduce the noise, the number of rigs, hopefully break up the protest.
The next document, please. SSM.NSC.can 50209. So this is the February 10th IRG. And we're going to get into this in more depth with your PCO colleagues tomorrow. But again, just a brief description of what the incident response group is, please.
The incident response group is a cabinet committee chaired by the Prime Minister that is used to make quick, rapid decisions about incidents of national importance or a crisis. Including national security incidents. It's been used multiple times. It was used over COVID. It was used for the Hurricane Fiona. It was used for the downing of Ukraine Flight 752. So it's an effective tool that the Prime Minister invokes in order to have discussions with both ministers and officials at the table so that he hears from subject matter experts, the Chief of the Defence Staff as an example, deputy ministers with particular expertise, as well as ministers.
Thank you. If we can just scroll down then to page 5, please. So February 10th, I believe, was the first IRG meeting?
Yes, it was.
Just going to find the actual page. Okay, here we go. So the National Security Advisor, you're giving that it's rather lengthy report here. Ottawa situation remains largely unchanged. Threats on social media persist. It continues to be used as a planning tool. Possibility of driving by Sussex and local schools. And you say there's indications that some protesters would like to leave but are unable to do so given physical barriers. Then an integrating planning cell is developing a plan of action. The preference remains to continue moving forward with negotiations, with enforcement actions to start early next week if negotiations remain unsuccessful. And then a surge and contain strategy will be employed for the upcoming weekend. So is it fair to say at that point that the notion of negotiating with the protesters is still very much on the table?
It was still being explored, absolutely.
Okay. Then you go on to talk about Coots, and there's a line here. The number of protesters have dropped from 200 to 40. However, those remaining are firmly entrenched in their views and there are weapons on site. So that's information that have been provided to you by the RCMP?
Yes.
Okay, the weapons were on site at Coots already.
Right. At that point, only the RCMP knew the extent of the weapons.
I'm sorry, only the RCMP knew the extent.
Yeah.
So you knew that they were present, but you had no idea about the extent.
That's correct.
If we can just keep scrolling down a bit, please, Mr. Clerk. CSIS reports tracking several individuals, and then there's some threat assessments by CSC and CSIS. Scroll down a little bit more, please, Mr. Clerk. Okay, I think that's probably it. So on that topic of negotiation or engagement, I just want to take you sort of a bit of an aside for a moment, but related. SSM can 406131. While that's being pulled up, I'll just situate this. So this is the engagement proposal about which the Commission has heard quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think just scroll down a little bit more. There we go, from Ms. Thomas. So this is a February 11th email at 2:30 p.m. that you send to the Janice Charette, who's the clerk, Nathalie Drouin, who's the deputy clerk. And what you say is you're forwarding the engagement proposal and you say, Rob has continued his engagement. I suggest we need to decide if this has a green light. I expect he will get more specifics. And then it just says we indicate a positive response. I think there's probably an if missing there, if we indicate a positive response. So can you situate what this email was about, what you were saying to the clerk and the deputy clerk when you sent it?
So the engagement proposal needed to be discussed by ministers, and certainly no deputy minister or I had the authority to move forward with engagement without it being discussed at a cabinet level. And the green light was to get it on the agenda to be discussed formally.
Okay. And did you have a view at that point on the engagement proposal, whether it was a good idea, a bad idea, likelihood of success?
My view at that time was that we should take nothing off the table. We had to continue to explore all options. We were going into the third weekend on February 11th. I didn't understand yet what the negotiating mandate would be. So you go with something and you expect to get something back. And we had no clarity on that. Further, we had no clarity because of the disparate group of people who were blockading Ottawa, and this was about Ottawa specifically, who would be the leader who would be able to coalesce the mass of humanity who are on the streets of Ottawa to then adhere to whatever was negotiated.
So beyond having a view that it shouldn't be taken on the table, did you ever form or were you ever asked for your view on whether it should or should not go ahead?
Not at this point. During the discussion, at Cabinet, views were sought.
Okay, so this is February 11th, and I believe it was brought to the IRG on February 12th.
Correct.
Correct, okay. And at that point, views were sought.
Correct.
And you provided a view?
I did.
And your view was?
Well, it's protected.
Got it. Okay. Can we then go to the February 12th IRG, ssm.nsc.can 50214? If we can scroll down then to page 5. In terms of specifics, just scroll down a little bit more. The nsia reported that the situation in Windsor remains very fluid, with law enforcement having begun to take action. In Ottawa, we're seeing a significant escalation in the boldness of protesters. So just stopping there, what does that mean? What was that observation?
Yeah, we were hearing this from the OPS and Intersect, and certainly, again, social media and media. Bouncy castles had happened. The view that they were here to stay, that they had zero regard for the citizens of Ottawa, that social media was talking more and more about aggressive action to stay, holding the line, dig in. It was just a change in tone that was noted. And sometimes changes are subtle, but you have to pay attention to them. We saw more people on the street that weekend than we had anticipated, and fewer people were leaving at the end of the day. And the raucous atmosphere was extending later into the evening. We saw things like the wrecking ball on Wellington Street by then. And so there was just a change in the forcefulness of the tone.
And did that have an effect on your assessment of the situation?
Well, you were also hearing the increased low level of violence, the fears of the citizens of Ottawa, the honking continued despite the injunction. What became apparent to us as we were assessing the situation is that this wasn't breaking up.
Okay, and then if we can just scroll down again, Mr. Clerk, to page 15. So this is part of what became known as the IRG tracker. Can you just explain, Ms. Thomas, what the IRG tracker was very briefly?
So the issues that were discussed at IRG and the action plan out of it was this tracker. I think the Prime Minister was, I'm paraphrasing here, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, of course. The Prime Minister and the clerk were concerned that people would discuss, leave the table, and then what would be the outcomes of the direction that was given. And so this was to track all the activity to understand what could be done and the progress, the status on achieving certain goals. So the action plan for tow trucks.
For instance.
For instance. So what was done, where did it stand, and we would update it every single day.
Okay, and the one that pertains specifically to your area is item number 4 here, which is identify immediate measures to close the intelligence gap, i.e. open source, non-criminal, non-terrorist. Can you elaborate on that? Is that the intelligence gap you referred to earlier, the social media?
It is. So the RCMP, OPP, OPS all collect open source information for law enforcement purposes. We saw that in Ophenden. CSIS collects some open source information in very specific circumstances for subjects or investigations of their own. We knew that social media was being used to mobilize, to plan actions, to talk about what was going to happen next, to talk to other protests across the country. You can't do that as so you can't track individuals. PCO cannot track individual social media. We didn't have the tools in place to do scraping of social media and understand the trends. As an example, one morning they talked about slow rolling convoys through school zones. It was being reported on the radio that this is all over Twitter. Why aren't the police doing anything about it? Not that the police can respond to everything they see on Twitter, and that's not what I'm implying at all. But if we had the correct tools and the legal mandate to collect this kind of information, we would have some understanding of the trends and where this was potentially going. We didn't have the tools or the mandate.
Okay, on that point, Mr. Clerk, I'll just ask you to turn up the witness summary, please. So that's WTS 5071 at page 6. It's under the social media intelligence gap. So, Ms. Thomas, I'll just ask you to elaborate with reference to this a little bit on some of the points you were making. For instance, the tools. What tools, when you say we didn't have the tools, what tools are needed to do that?
Well, there are IA-based tools that can be purchased to look for keywords, to look for algorithms. And we don't have those. You can't put a person in front of the screen and just have them Google convoy and get enough information quickly enough to do anything with it. So you actually need computer-based tools to do computer-based analysis.
Okay. And then scrolling down the page again a bit, please. Thank you. So just the point where it says NSIA Thomas there. One of the issues that was identified there was distinguishing between credible threats and non-credible threats on social media. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the difficulties, if any, you faced with that?
That is one of the primary problems that we're facing right now. The level of violent threats against the Prime Minister and other elected officials and some public figures, Dr. Tam, as an example, received enormous hate online, and some of it was threatening and indicated a threat against her. Distinguishing a credible threat, an identifiable person with an identifiable identifiable threat that looks like they have the capability to execute that threat. So not only intent, but capability is sort of the formula used to understand if a threat is credible or not. The problem is online, people are difficult, in some cases close to impossible to identify. You know, throw burner accounts, et cetera. It is easy to hide an identity online. Now the RCMP and other police services do a very good job of those kinds of investigations, but in the moment, in the middle of this crisis, with the number of threats going up against elected officials, it was an enormous problem and an enormous concern.
Okay, now we'll move on to the February 13th, please. So, Mr. Clerk, that's SSM NSC CAN 50216. Scroll down to page 8, please. So this is the cabinet meeting on February 13th, and this is the report that you're giving it. This was definitely a key moment in the events and in the eventual decision to invoke. and you're reporting on what you've heard from various agencies, including CSIS and including the RCMP. I don't know if you had a chance to see the RCMP's testimony the other day, but Commissioner Lucky testified that she was never asked to speak either at the IRG meeting on February 13th or at the cabinet meeting on February 13th. And there's a key bit of well, I call it evidence, but it's information at the time, where Commissioner Lucky had expressed the view to Mike Jones, who is the Minister of Public Safety's Chief of Staff, that law enforcement had not yet exhausted all available tools to it. Is that a message that you, who were asked to speak at these meetings, conveyed to the IRG or to Cabinet at either of those meetings?
No, I was not. And we build my speaking points from the information from the agencies and departments. I will say that at an IRG, deputy ministers and deputy heads, individuals who are at that meeting are expected to provide information that is of use to decision makers, being the Prime Minister and his cabinet. And so if there is useful information or critical information, it needs to be provided, whether you're on the speaking list or not.
Was that information provided by Commissioner Lucky to you?
And the DMOC meeting that morning, she said that there was possibly a plan with the OPS and OPP. She had said that several times previously.
Okay, so that's about whether or not there was a plan in Ottawa.
Yes.
Did she say anything specific, or did you know that her view was law enforcement had not yet exhausted all its tools?
No.
Okay. The next document is SSM NSC CAN 50298. So these are your talking points for this meeting. Chronologically a little out of order, but that's okay. Okay, so here again we see the mood of the organizers in Ottawa appears emboldened. So that's essentially a repeat of a point that's been made on a previous day, no change there. And then there's talk of City of Ottawa announced agreement with protest leader Tamara Leach that could lead to approximately 70% of trucks and cars leaving the residential areas in the downtown core over the next 24 hours. Then they explain a little bit more detail about that. Given the anti-government sentiment of Ottawa Group, along with the decentralized nature of its leadership, it is unclear at this time the concurrence of other leaders in the group to the agreement. So is that your assessment of the situation there?
It was our collective assessment, yes. And we were already seeing signs that the agreement was falling apart, that other leaders, other parts of the blockade were saying, no, we're not leaving.
Okay, so
that there is no deal.
Would it be fair to say that at this point your confidence in negotiation with dialoguing with protesters was no longer what it had previously been?
At this point, it was very clear that there was no one person or group to dialogue with where you could get achievable outcomes, which meant the group breaking up in downtown Ottawa.
We're going to move now to the February 14th DMOC. So that's ssm.nsc.can 50217. Bottom of page 1. Just keep scrolling a bit. There we go. OPS has approved a joint operational plan for Ottawa developed with support from RCMP and OPP will be put into action in coming days. So this is now, we're on February 14th. In your recollection, when was Cabinet made aware that a plan was coalescing to carry out an operation in downtown Ottawa?
I don't recall Cabinet being informed of that. But on I will go back to on February 13th, this had also been said, and there was an IRG, and at this point, so it wasn't said at the IRG, at this point, we had no evidence of that. And so while it was said, and these are the minutes, there is no evidence that there was a plan. And as I noted, we had been told there was a plan multiple times.
When you say no evidence, what kind of evidence would you have expected to see?
We would expect some level of assurance from the RCMP that the people were in place, it was executable. We don't expect to see details, that's policing. But we needed a level of assurance that yes, finally, the officers needed, the equipment needed, the executable strategic and tactical plan was there. The same thing that had been asked for several days. We didn't have any evidence or assurance that that was in fact where we were.
Do you think that that falls into the law enforcement reporting gap that you discussed earlier, the sort of the information sharing between law enforcement and your level?
I think that's part of it, yes. I also think that the plans were just not quite as firm as we would have hoped.
Okay. Also on February 14th then, pb.nsc.can40s8485, please. Scroll down, please. Scroll down again. I think it'll probably be the bottom of the second page that we want to start with. There we go. Mm-hmm. So this is a series of emails that you sent the morning of February 14th around 11:45 noon. The first one is, I need an assessment for Janice about the threat of these blockades, the characters involved, the weapons, the motivation. Clearly, this isn't just COVID and is a threat to democracy and rule of law. Could I get an assessment, please? David, I assume that's David Vigneault. CSIS Director, is this you? It's a very short fuse. Please call if you have questions. Can you explain what that email was about? Who was it to? What was it about? What were you looking for and why?
So I don't remember all the people on the two, but probably Mike McDonald, David Vigneault, RCMP. It was part of a complete package of information that was being put together. There had been multiple threat assessments, but this was to be a formal document, and we had just discussed it in a conversation. And so we had talked about the need for a last formal document should Cabinet decide to proceed with the Emergencies Act, as opposed to in the daily updates we were giving. So laying out the entire spectrum of threat. And so I needed it very quickly. We were going to collate it. We just needed the information from the agencies.
Okay, so the intention was to get that assessment for Ms. Charette, the clerk, and she would then provide it to
the Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, okay. And we just scroll up a bit to the next email. So this one is to Mike McDonald, Rob Stewart, something blanked out, Inez Neville, and Martin Green. Inez Neville, who's that?
She's my Chief of Staff.
Okay, perfect. This is about a national threat to national interests and institutions by people who do not care about or understand democracy, who are preparing to be violent, who are motivated by anti-government sentiment. What are you saying there? Are you setting out what the assessment should say, or?
I was being asked questions about how specific it should be. And so that was my response.
How specific it should be in terms of?
Of what the threat was and sort of the range of issues that were of concern. So national interest in institutions, lack of confidence in police as police were being stretched across the country, the desire to have government policy changed by force, mandates. There were people preparing to be violent. We saw it on social media. We certainly knew that both CSIS and RCMP had concern about some people and the potential for violence. And there was certainly an anti-government sentiment throughout.
So does what is reflected in this email reflect your assessment of the situation at the time?
Not everybody on the ground, absolutely. This wasn't a monolithic group of people. But yes, those elements were there.
Was that assessment ever produced to you?
I don't think it was.
And why would that not happen?
I think it fell through the cracks and we were overtaken by events.
Okay, the next topic I want to address, or the next document, let's start with the document, SSM.can 50297. Before I go there, actually, if that document had been produced, that threat assessment, it would have been CSIS who did it, or would have been the RCMP who would have been?
We would have, PCO probably would have written it based on information received from all the agencies.
Okay, so it was a call for input so that PCO itself could produce the.
Correct.
Okay. So the topic I want to address with you now is something that has come up, will come up, and will forever be part of the Commission's inquiry, which is this idea of what is a threat to national security. This email, scroll down a bit, just want to see. So this is an email from you to Jacqueline Bogdan, a fellow named Philippe Lafortune. Can you tell us who that is?
Philippe Lafortune worked for Mike MacDonald, I believe it was Mike, in the Security and Intelligence Group.
Okay. So Philippe did some research, which is handy to keep in our quote unquote back pocket, FYI, at this stage, Mike. And the date of this is February 9th. So before the IRG started, this research was done. Mike, as requested, we did some digging on the Canadian definition of national security. As you know, one of the challenges on this issue is that the GOC, Government of Canada, never ended up formally defining it. However, we looked at transition materials and various acts to provide you with the best answer and its potential applicability to the current situation. Below, you will find a policy definition of national security, but also NSICO. Can you explain what NSICO is? If not, it'll make me feel better about my lack of acronym knowledge.
I do not offhand.
Take on it, and what the CSIS Act, SCIDA, SCIDA.
That's the information sharing.
Information sharing, okay, and the Emergency Act stipulate on the issue. Here are the various pieces. We'll just, I think, probably read through most of this email because it's quite relevant. But first of all, before we get into the specifics of it, can you explain the context of why that information was being sought?
No, I don't think I asked for it. I don't recall, unless there's an email that says I did ask for it. But it is an ongoing question. Who defines national security? What is the definition? And even in the national security policy in 2003, I think it was written, it wasn't really defined.
Okay, so that's what Monsieur Lafortune is talking about when he says the problem is it's never been formally defined?
Correct.
Okay. And how would that be formally defined if it were to be?
In a public policy.
In a policy. So not in legislation, but in a policy.
Yes, correct.
A Government of Canada policy of some sort?
Right, a national security policy as an example.
Okay. And that would be something prepared by, if it were to exist, PCO?
No, probably public safety.
Public safety.
As the policy lead on national security issues.
Okay. So here we have the first, national security pertains to the safety and security of Canada's territory, government, economy, and people, as well as the promotion and protection of Canadian national interests. National interest refers to Canada's sovereignty, democratic processes and institutions, security, territorial integrity, economic prosperity, social cohesion, environmental protection, and a healthy and resilient communities. That's the NSICOP. So NSICOP, I believe, is the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians annual report. So that's about as broad a definition of national security as one could possibly imagine.
That's correct.
Then there's the legislative perspective reported by Monsieur Lafortune. What he says is there is no true legislative definition of quote unquote national security. The CSIS Act and SCIDA provide examples of threats to security and activities that undermine security. However, do not exclusively define what is included in the term quote unquote security, as their lists are non-exhaustive, and do not specifically reference quote unquote national security. And then there's the definition of the CSIS Act, which we're all familiar with now. Just scroll down a little bit, Mr. Clerk. SCIDA has its own definition here. Scroll down a little bit more. Then there's a quote from a Supreme Court ruling. I think the case is actually called Suresh, not Sunresh, but and so what the Supreme Court says in Suresh is they talk about danger, a fair, large, and liberal interpretation in accordance with international norms must be accorded to danger to the security of Canada. And they're talking about deportation here. And then they say the danger to the security of Canada is difficult to define. And then they go on and talk about a broad and flexible approach, et cetera, et cetera. Then, I think this is now Monsieur Lafortune, not part of Suresh, the Emergency Act, and he talks about how the Emergency Act does define national emergencies as the following, and then he gives a definition which again is familiar to us here in the Commission. So you received this email and this sort of memo, if I can call it, on national security. Did that have any impact on your thinking, your assessment of the situation that was happening at the time?
No, it laid out the complexity of understanding how to define the problem set, absolutely, but not particularly. We received a lot of information in those days.
And would this memo be something that was kept internally to PCO, or would it have been disseminated, shared? Would it have been briefed up to Cabinet?
It wouldn't have, I don't believe it was ever discussed at Cabinet, but certainly it was shared with other deputy ministers.
And you're aware, of course, that CSIS assessed the protests as not constituting a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act.
They said it did not meet the threshold as defined in their very narrow interpretation of what they can do under their act.
And obviously we'll hear directly from them on that on
Yes.
Monday, I believe. But were you personally ever asked to advise on whether that definition had been met?
No.
Were you ever asked whether you thought that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was necessary?
Yes.
And when was that?
February 13th.
And what was your answer?
It was discussed in a Cabinet meeting.
Let's see how we're doing for time here. Oh, we have time. Okay, so the next thing. Oh,
Or
yes.
the afternoon break, sorry.
Morning, afternoon, evening,
Yeah.
whatever it is. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
We can take the break now, take 15 minutes, and we'll come back and continue. Thank you.
The commission is in recess for 15 minutes. La commission levée pour 15 minutes.
Go ahead.
Ms. Thomas, I understand that you had some discussions at break with your counsel, which actually obviated the need for me to have a discussion with your counsel about whether or not you could answer some questions about the inputs that you and views you expressed to Cabinet on a couple of issues. So I'm just going to ask you those questions again. The first is with respect to the engagement proposal. What view did you express to Cabinet on the engagement proposal?
After the discussion was concluded, my view is that it was not a workable plan.
And this would be on February 12th?
Yes.
And why did you form that view?
That I did not see who we would negotiate, engage with, what the outcomes could possibly be, that there was not one group who had enough influence over the entire group to affect an outcome that would be positive. And I did not know who we would put in front of them. Esteemed and capable as my colleague, Deputy Minister Stewart, was, that wasn't going to be a name that was going to mean anything to the protesters. And so who it would be, what they would do, and who it would be with were unanswerable questions. We had also seen negotiations attempted and fail in Windsor. And we actually, as has been testified here, knew that in Coutts, the engagement strategy and the lessening and the path to reducing and removing mandates in Alberta actually caused the protesters there to dig in, because they thought that would then allow for a complete removal immediately. So the unintended consequences were greater than the consequences.
And the second question that fell into that category of whether or not you could answer is whether you were ever asked whether the Emergencies Act was necessary.
Yes, and I apologize. Yes. And my answer was yes.
Okay. And that was on February 13th?
Yes.
The other area I'd like to take you back to briefly, just to elaborate on a little bit, is this idea of the law enforcement gap in reporting. So for that, can we pull up the witness summary again, please? So it's WTS, bunch of zeros, 71. Down to the bottom of page 7, please. Okay, so you've discussed here two different sort of intelligence gaps that you've identified. One is the social media gap that you've spoken about, and we may speak a bit about again. The other is the law enforcement intelligence gap. So what you've expressed here is a slightly more elaborate view than you'd expressed earlier today. So you didn't receive, and this is you and Assistant Secretary Mike MacDonald, Social Security and Intelligence, did not receive direct reports from law enforcement partners such as OPP, OPS, and WPS, so that's outside the quote-unquote federal family. You can tell I'm learning the lingo. That constituted another significant intelligence sharing gap. Assistant Secretary MacDonald recalled a significant delay in receiving updates from the RCMP, given the RCMP's policy obligation to consult with each relevant agency prior to sharing investigative and operational information. And you clarified that neither you nor your staff received SITREP, so situation reports, project reports, or other forms of information directly. And as you mentioned today, you hadn't heard of Project Hendon specifically. And if we just scroll down a little bit, it also says there that you learned of the Coutts arrests through the media, not directly from the RCMP. And just scrolling down a little bit again, sharing among all three levels of government and information and intelligence in relation to the convoy could have been better. So I'll just ask you to elaborate a little bit on where you think the deficiencies are and what maybe can be or should be done about them. Because as you know, the Commission has a sort of a forward-looking mandate as well as a backward-looking one. So
I think when we are looking at primarily open source information as opposed to investigation-specific information. So let's draw a line there. The RCMP is investigating person X for having done something criminal. As the NSIA, should I receive that? No. I receive information when the RCMP are making an arrest of a federal crime that would be of interest to the NSIA. So, but after they've done it or as they're about to make the arrest or make the announcement, general tactical operational information on a day-to-day basis, I don't have any need for from the RCMP. But when we're in a situation like this, it's a crisis, I'm coordinating the town, the RCMP is where I'm coordinating the town, I'm asking for information about what's happening, what's coming, what they expect, what, not again operational planning, but what is going to happen, what law enforcement is talking about, what their concerns are, because there are ways I can help, potentially. It would be useful to have that information. And we didn't receive the flow of information from the RCMP, even their intelligence unit, that I think we possibly might have.
When you say there are ways you can help, what are you referring to?
We would do X, Y, or Z, and we think this is necessary. We're short 100 people, or we need cabinet permission, or we need, it could be any number of things. And the hypotheticals are long. But in this particular situation, I think that we could help reduce the pressure on the RCMP to answer questions constantly if we had some indication of the intelligence they were seeing, primarily, again, open source, and what they were going to do with it. We could answer questions. We could reduce the anxiety about what was going on.
So from your perspective, keeping in mind the need for police independence, which...
Absolutely. This isn't interference or telling them what to do, and it's not getting in the way of an operation. It's just information flow.
So there's some work to be done in the area.
Correct.
From your perspective of information flows between law enforcement and government.
Absolutely.
Switching gears a little bit, the next topic I want to address with you is sort of an existential one, but the line between lawful and unlawful protest. And I'm going to do this with reference to a few documents in which this was brought up and came up repeatedly over the course of the events of the convoy. The first one, Mr. Clerk, is ssm.nsc.can 303211. We can scroll down to page 2, please. So this is a readout or report from ADM and SOPS on January 26th. Excuse me. There we go, under posture. So first they're talking about the RCMP monitoring, and then ADM's committed to return to the committee with specifics on what will trigger the event from peaceful event to one requiring law enforcement action. So I realize this ADM and SOPS, not specifically at your level, but is it fair to say that that was something on the radar? When does an event go from lawful to unlawful?
Absolutely. It was a question that we discussed constantly. And I don't know if there may be a policing definition, but there certainly isn't a public policy definition.
And you'll see it says here, ADM's committed to return with specifics. To your knowledge, and I know this isn't your committee, but to your knowledge, did that happen?
I didn't see it. If it did, I did not see it.
Okay. It may be that the next document is the answer, but I'm not sure. ssm.nsc.can 50294. At page 6, please. Under peaceful event. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Peaceful event. Key question remain. How does this end and who is left? E.g., numbers may be lower, but what is the threat nature of remaining individuals? And then there is no finite timeline for when a lawful protest must end. As long as it remains lawful, it may continue. Violence will require a public order response. OPS has brought in additional support teams. Okay, so that is something being said about the line between lawful and unlawful. I don't know if it's, I think maybe you don't know either because it wasn't your committee, whether that was the specific sort of deliverable return on that point. But if so, it's not a particularly detailed answer.
Yeah, I think there are distinct issues. When a lawful protest ends versus when it trips into something else. I think those are two different issues. And one is very much a city issue, how long the city gives permits for protests, those kinds of things. I think that's more in the city's domain. When it moves from lawful to unlawful and becomes a public order issue, again, mostly belonging to a municipality, but we are in a unique circumstance here in Windsor, in Coots, across the country. When do protests, blockades, become unlawful? Because this is talking about the OPS, but the question we were asking ourselves was, much broader.
Okay. That's a helpful distinction, actually, and it'll come up in the following discussions. So the next document is ssm.can 5016. So this is a readout of the February 14th DMOC. And if we can scroll down a bit to page 2, please. There we go. The NSIA and Director of CCLA. So this is the DMOC that's being held on February 14th. Do you remember what time that DMOC was?
There were, I think there were 2 on February 14th, or there might have been 2 on the 13th, but we were generally meeting in the morning before we briefed ministers.
Okay. So the NSIA and the Director of CCLA highlighted the need to better understand where and how the convoys metastasized into something else. We have seen a fundamental shift. Protest that affects people's ability to live and exist is no longer peaceful, need to understand long-term trends. So can you tell the Commission a little bit what your thinking was there in saying that the protests had metastasized, the convoys rather, metastasize into something else?
It was my recollection is that it was a very interesting conversation, one that we needed to spend more time on, but in the height of a crisis, you move on to operational things very quickly. It was a discussion about lawful and unlawful, violent and peaceful, and can you be unlawful and still, for all intents and purposes, peaceful, meaning you're not January 6th? And is that line of violence only measured when you are at the January 6th status, series of events, or is the violence the people of Ottawa were experiencing on the streets, the inability of people in Windsor to conduct their lives in the neighborhood where the blockade was, the inability of the town of Coots to function, is that a line? And so where is that? And I don't have an answer for it, but it is something that we have to consider as situations like this perhaps become more of the norm. And what we were discussing is that the only measure can't be violence of a nature of January 6th. That can't be, well, this is something different, or January 6th is about to happen, therefore it is now not only illegal, but a national security threat. There is a spectrum of activity and behavior and threat in there that we need to understand. And so that was the nature of the conversation. And it's one that's continued. I can't tell you that I have a paper on it yet. We don't have a policy paper to bring forward to the clerk, but it is a conversation that is continuing because it's critical. We have seen these kind of uprisings in democracies around the world. What does it mean? What can we do? What should we do? Questions to be asked that have to be thoughtfully considered before we're in this situation potentially again.
In a sense, I think you've preempted my next question, which is this an area that is being worked on within the federal government, is in case anything like this ever happens again, where that line is? And when you talk about the line between lawful and unlawful, in some senses, that's the line where intervention would happen.
Correct. And yes, the work is ongoing.
The next document, please, Mr. Clerk, ssm.nsc.can 50405. So this is a related point, Ms. Thomas, to situate you a little bit on the need to protect lawful protest. There is unlawful protest at some point. We don't know precisely where that line is, you've said, but the need to protect lawful protest in all circumstances where possible. Was there any thought given, and I'll wait for the reference to turn up here, but in your recollection, was there any thought given in the discussions around how to intervene once it became clear that there was going to be intervention in what was happening in Ottawa specifically. I mean, I suppose it would apply across Canada, but specifically in Ottawa, to protecting lawful protest so a subset of that protest. Was there any thought given to, okay, well, you can't do it on Wellington Street, but maybe you can go somewhere else? And I'll just situate you a little bit here. Can we turn down to page, of course I don't have the page, I believe it's page 2. It could be a bit later. Sorry, keep scrolling, I'll find it. Keep scrolling, please. Oh, no, I guess not. Page 5, sorry. Yeah, okay, there we go. So this is a description, and I realize it's not your description, it's the RCMP, I believe, but keep scrolling a bit down, please, Mr. Clerk. I'll tell you when you got it. Okay, yeah. The focus of the operation today has been on clearing protesters south of Wellington and reinforcing barriers. Protesters remain at Bank and Sparks, have been advised that they'll be arrested if they do not leave. Public order units continue to wear tactical gear, but police tactics remain focused on de-escalation. This is February 20th. Police are also monitoring a gathering that has formed the War Museum of approximately 100 people and a smaller gathering of 30 to 50 at Confederation Park. Information suggests some indication some protesters are staying in the secure zone, and I think that's about it. So, including at hotels in this area, RCMP is looking into. So these other areas, the War Museum and at this point it's Confederation Park, were these lawful protest zones to your knowledge at this point?
I'm speculating in terms of the particular situation. The Emergency Act was still in place. I don't know if these locations, because I don't have the map in front of me, are still in the exclusion zone or not. And so if in the exclusion zone, by virtue of the act, if inside the exclusion zone, they would have been illegal. In regards to your question about protecting lawful protest, that's a fundamental. People who wish to protest lawfully, peacefully, respecting the rights of, in this case, the citizens of Ottawa, that's a given in this city. The right to do that is a given in the Constitution. It's just a fundamental right Canadians have. That discussion, again, about when it metastasizes into something else is what we are pursuing.
So I think this will be the last area that we can cover today, but I want to ask you about a couple of intelligent assessments, secretariat assessments that were produced to the Commission. The first one is ssm.nsc.can 40218. Called Context for Civil Unrest Following Pandemic. So first of all, this is a document dated February 16th. Can you tell us the genesis of how did this document come into being?
So when we spoke about the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat, I said that they will do longer thought pieces as well as immediate operational assessments. So the immediate, the missile strike in Poland, this is an example of the kind of thought they do, piece they do to look at trends, to understand the context in which foreign policy, security, and intelligence issues are nested. This is a companion piece to something that they had written, well, long before I came to PCO. I was given it to read just as I arrived at PCO, about what happens in societies historically after pandemics. And so a very interesting piece, and this was a companion to it.
Okay, so you already had a piece on what happens after pandemics.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll take you through a little bit of this, and you can tell me if this is something that would have been known before February 16th and formed part of the context you were thinking about, or whether it was an ex post facto. So the first thing. Just introduction. Historically, civil unrest, degradation of social cohesion have been common in the immediate aftermath of pandemics or epidemics. The health impacts and restrictions involved provide fertile ground for social unrest and mobilization as pandemics progress or end. This is particularly true when there are existing underlying inequalities and/or social fault lines within the population. The ongoing trucker protests have several markers demonstrating consistency with this trend. So is this something that was part of your thinking when the convoys rolled in, or was this something that was only thought about after the fact?
I didn't know about the previous piece when the convoys rolled in, because again, I wasn't at PCO, and in my job at Defence, I hadn't seen it. The clerk brought it to my attention as something she had read and found very interesting, and so I pulled it up and read it, and this was done as an addition to that.
So that, if I understand correctly, it wasn't part of your personal thinking, but it may have been part of the thinking at PCO.
I think it was part of thinking implies. I think it was more it was just informative.
If we just scroll down a little bit more, it speaks to Canadian historical context, 1885 vaccine requirements intended to curtail the spread of smallpox resulted in public violence throughout the city. Per the Washington Post, more than 2,000 violent rioters marched through the streets of Montreal screaming, "Kill the vaccinators," in response to vaccine mandates. So again, this would be part of the context that PCO was aware of at the time and was thinking about, but not your specific thinking.
Some people were aware. Was it of the documents we talk about on a daily basis at PCO? Was it one of them? No.
Okay.
IAS, the Intelligence Assessment Group, puts out a lot of these. People read them not as an immediate to do their job. They read them as thought pieces when they have time on the weekend. And so who's read it in PCO, I couldn't tell you.
And what would be the purpose of having an assessment like this done?
Again, the assessment group takes global trends, takes events, and tries to help predict what will happen. And they use, in this case, a lot of academic and historical research to build their assessment.
Okay. The next assessment is ssm.nsc.can 40231. So the first paragraph here, it talks about the date of this one is the 21st of February. So this is right actually as the Emergencies Act was being lifted and to a certain extent events were coming to an end. And it says here, the Freedom Convoy is not an unprecedented event. Again, talking about societal alienation, civil unrest and social polarization. But then it says the convergence of several elements make this protest somewhat more sophisticated and unique. The use of social media for organizing and communicating both internally and externally. The use of misinformation and disinformation to promote certain narratives. The use of crowdfunding, cryptocurrency, blockade tactics and logistics, virulence of discourse towards government and elected officials, appropriation of national symbols, and it goes on. Then it mentions then the overwhelming majority of protesters have denounced violence or not directly aligned. Then it talks about the wide range of participants. And if we just scroll down a little bit, the movement talks about the IMV aspect. It's unlikely that premeditated violence will take place. However, the threat of lone actors. Scroll down again. Significant international financial support and publicity. So it's sort of collating the information that was available then. And then it says the Freedom Convoy itself or new entities that emerge from it are likely to continue for several weeks and will seek new opportunities to protest, occupy, and disrupt. It may also embolden other groups and individual movements across the ideological spectrum. There are also risks that the protests may serve to deepen and harden new and existing cleavages within Canadian society. As the protests persist, these feelings may become more entrenched and form the basis for longer-term societal schisms. So can you speak to this a little bit and just situate the context in which all of this was being dealt with at the time by you?
So, as I said, I didn't have a domestic intelligence assessment unit at PCO. And all of the intelligence assessment or collectors in the community have very narrow mandates. ITAC does terrorist threat assessment. CSIS does assessments in line with their act. RCMP does criminal assessments and collects open source for law enforcement purposes. I have a foreign intelligence assessment group that takes open source and covert information and can give me a picture of what's going on. And not just me, decision makers, the Prime Minister. I didn't have an equal entity in PCO for open source, domestic. And I asked Martin Green, the Assistant Secretary of the Intelligence Assessment Group, to start trying to think about what this could look like. I was hoping, this was a really interesting piece. It wasn't exactly what I wanted in the minute. I wanted more, here's what we're seeing tomorrow. But a very useful piece where he tried to be very thoughtful about what this could mean based on known aspects of protests, what we were seeing in other countries, conversations with colleagues in other countries about similar phenomena, and try to build an idea of what this could mean from an intelligence perspective, but what it would mean for government institutions, democracy, rule of law, the things that we need to consider as senior public servants advising government.
Those are my questions for you today, Ms. Thomas, but before I sit down, is there anything that we haven't covered today that you'd like to raise?
No, I don't think so. Certainly, there's been a lot of focus on Ottawa because it was significant, and it was on, at the footsteps of where our democracy is housed. This was a national situation, and our concern about Windsor, as you've heard from other people, Coots, the pop-up convoys across the country, the intelligence that we were getting about potentials in New Brunswick, Cornwall, the Peace Bridge, Via Rail protests, that all came together to form our view of what was going on and raise our level of concern. So while, yes, Ottawa was a significant event, this was a national crisis.
Okay, now if I could call on the convoy organizers, please.
My name is Brendan Miller, and I'm counsel for Freedom Corp, which is the entity that represents the protesters that were in Ottawa in January and February of 2022. I have a few questions for you, and hopefully we'll be able to get through them. Ma'am, you had just mentioned, and I'm glad you did, the rule of law. What's your understanding of the rule of law?
That laws are obeyed in the country of Canada, provincial, federal, and municipal laws.
Right. And you agree with me that the rule of law applies to you, and it applies to the executive and the elected executive of the government of Canada?
Yes.
All right. Would you agree with this, that the rule of law conveys a sense of orderliness and executive accountability to legal authority and vouches safe a stable, predictable, and ordered society in which citizens and residents may conduct their affairs. It requires that government power or any authority delegated by Parliament must be exercised pursuant to valid laws, either directly or indirectly permitted by an act of Parliament. Do you agree with that?
I do.
All right. Now, you can agree with me that your position, your office, and I'll call it your office, the National Intelligence and Security Advisor, it's not been created by an act of Parliament, has it?
No,
No.
it does not. It's an advisor.
Right. And you have no statutory mandate.
I do not.
And you've also got no legal powers yourself.
I do not, which I explained when I talked about what my role is.
Right. And I take it you've never been an intelligence officer with CSIS or within the intelligence community, is that correct?
I have not.
And you've never been an intelligence analyst with CSIS or in the intelligence community, is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. So you said in your evidence that you didn't feel that you were getting the proper intelligence or updated intelligence from law enforcement or from CSIS, or weren't getting enough of it. Is that fair?
I didn't say that about CSIS.
All right. So you were satisfied with the intelligence you received from CSIS?
I was.
And CSIS specifically told you and Cabinet that there was no Section 2 CSIS Act threat posed by the protest or posed by any of the actions going on throughout Canada at the time, did they not?
You're misinterpreting what CSIS said.
Can you tell me how? Because I can put up the statement and
Right.
the reports, because
Right.
that's what it says.
But there isn't, what they said and the interpretation of what they said are two entirely different things. Their mandate is very narrow. And so Section 2 of the CSIS Act is about the work that CSIS does and the intelligence they collect. And they said they are not the only arbiters of what is a national security threat in this country.
Okay.
And so, very true that they said that vis-a-vis their particular act.
Right. And the thing is you agree with me that the CSIS Act, the meaning of security threat to Canada, is incorporated directly into the Emergencies Act, correct?
You're going to receive legal briefs on the Emergencies Act and the legal interpretation, and I'm not a lawyer. My understanding is that the Emergencies Act is assigned the meaning as defined in the CSIS Act, but is not limited by the CSIS Act.
Well, I don't know how that could be, but we can agree to disagree. But you agree that the Emergencies Act, on its own reading, and I put this to the Deputy Minister, you understand that it requires reasonable grounds that a Section 2 CSIS Act threat exists.
I don't agree.
That's what it says.
No, it says it assigns meaning as the language is defined in the CSIS Act. But again, you'll get legal arguments.
Right, I understand. So you're saying that the CSIS Act and Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which is incorporated into the Emergencies Act, means something different when you're looking at it.
No, that's not what I've said.
So what do you mean?
I mean that in terms of the Emergency Act, the governor and council can consider more broadly than the intelligence collected by CSIS in determining a national security threat or situation or a public order emergency.
I understand that, but you do agree that the four grounds of types of threats in Section 2 of the CSIS Act are what is in fact required to have been found.
No, I don't agree.
So it can go beyond what the Act says, which is a threat to the security of Canada.
There are other definitions of threats to the security of Canada, as we saw earlier.
Right, but not in the legislation.
The Emergency Act allows for the governor and council to make a broad decision about public order emergencies.
That's not what it says, but you can agree with me.
I think that this is an argument to have with lawyers.
Well, I understand that. So let's go through then just what Section 2 of the CSIS Act says, and I'll just ask you a couple of questions about the grounds. And we've already heard from every law enforcement official as well as we have the statements from CSIS and evidence, that they didn't have reasonable suspicion that any of this was taking place. So I take it that you can agree with me that you didn't have any evidence with you before cabinet or even considered of any espionage or sabotage against Canada that is detrimental to the interests of Canada or activities directed towards or in support of such espionage or sabotage, right?
That's been discussed, yes.
Right. And so that, there was no evidence of that that you considered
No.
in your assessment. And you could agree with me that there's no evidence of foreign influenced activities within or related to Canada that are detrimental to the interests of Canada, are clandestine or deceptive, or involve a threat to any person, correct?
There were threats to people.
Right. By email and Twitter, right?
I would submit that in the social media era, you cannot ignore threats against officials and public office holders just because they are on social media. That would be inexcusably negligent.
Right. But that's up to the police to deal with, or is that a national emergency?
It depends on the situation in the context in which those threats arrive.
Okay. Can we please bring up document ts.nsc.can.001 000000206_rel0001. Oh, apologies, just a second. Wrong one. I'll just say the end numbers. Same forward. 159_rel0001. Okay, so I take it that you're familiar with the CSIS assessment that they provided on the Freedom Convoy in downtown Ottawa, right?
That's one of the assessments.
Right, okay. And their assessment was this, and at the beginning, you see downtown Ottawa was actually quite festive, not threatening to a passerby. Some criminal acts did occur, law enforcement. And again, you've said you're not an intelligence officer, you don't have any training as an intelligence analysis, so I take it you rely on CSIS for intelligence.
CSIS provides one input on intelligence, yes.
Yeah, and then the RCMP?
Another input,
Right, and then the Canadian Border Services Agencies?
another input,
Right, and then you also have the Canadian Security Establishment?
yes.
Right, okay. None of those people provided you intelligence that there was a Section 2 CSIS Act threat?
Again, we've been through this. There are other measures other than Section 2 of the CSIS Act.
So let's scroll down, if we can. And you'll see in there with respect to the flags. Now, I take it there was concern with these flags that there was a couple of flags that were seen that were inappropriate, and that was one of the reasons why there was a consideration of ideological motivated violent extremism. You can see there that I understand that their report is a very small number of more inflammatory flags, Confederate, Nazi, swastika, 3%er, Punisher, based on the 1974 comic book hero, and Quebec Patriot flag. And then they say that a random flag is just a flag until the reason the person holding it explains why. Flags can have multiple meanings and are routinely co-opted by various groups, individuals. No way of connecting those views holding flags with any online content. The presence of 3% flags, for example, does not necessarily mean that members of the 3% are in attendance. And that was the intelligence you were given.
That's part of the intelligence we were given. That's intelligence that can be released.
Okay. So what do you mean intelligence can be released? So,
Well, there's Section 38.
right, I understand that. But why don't we scroll down? Now, this is important. And you know that CSIS does, in fact, because there's no reason, you don't need a law to look at what's online or open source intelligence, that it's open source intelligence. Anybody can look at it without a law authorizing it. Can you agree with that?
No, the reality is that open source intelligence has to be anonymized so that we are not targeting specific people who are not under investigation. So it's not quite as simple as you're depicting it.
Well, ma'am, again, there's no privacy interest for Canadians on things they post online. Anybody can go on and read it, right? You know that.
Yes, but the privacy commissioner and the privacy laws of this country are such that they cannot then their information cannot be scraped and be part of an assessment writ large. There has to be boundaries around that.
Around its distribution.
No, around its analysis and collection.
Right, and that's
and
why
storage.
And that's why we have units in the RCMP that do that.
Some of it, yes.
Right, so you have I believe it's called the IMCIT unit. That's all they look at, is they look at online violent rhetoric and assess it.
For criminal purposes, yes.
Right, and so for violent rhetoric, what are your other purposes other than criminal purposes?
Well, so I would like to be a little more expansive in this answer, if I may be. An analyst looks at a piece of information for very specific issues. When we, as people advising, and it's my deputy minister colleagues and I, to advise the cabinet and decision makers on the threat, the confidence in government institutions, the rhetoric, we have to look more broadly than at specific elements as described here. Someone should kill the PM. Wouldn't it be great if someone killed the PM? That says something. And it's not just random because they can't identify it to an individual and it doesn't say the day, doesn't mean it doesn't matter.
So what are you looking for? Are you looking that the government without warrants is allowed just to go and look into metadata?
No, that's what I just said to you.
Yeah, so
I just said to you
here's
that
the
we
thing.
should not be doing that. And so we have to find a legal framework for it. We are actually violently agreeing.
Okay, well, that's good. So, and we agree that we should follow legal frameworks.
We should. And I believe there is a gap in the legal
Yeah,
framework.
and you agree we should follow the legal framework in the Emergencies Act, right?
And we have.
Okay. And then can I just show you that part up there? CSIS assessed this, and
Excuse me, we've never established the date of this document. Can we see what it's dated, please?
Freedom Convoy 2022, it's an assessment of CSIS. I believe it's been referred to in the statement. It's from your production. I assume that it's relevant and material.
I'm not arguing that. I'm just asking
Yeah.
to establish if there's a date
Okay.
on the document, perhaps at the last page.
No, but I understand that, and the witness has accepted that this was one of the assessments that was before cabinet. So,
Well, no, I didn't say it was before cabinet. I said it was produced.
okay. And
I believe it was before the
I
convoy
understand.
arrived.
So the CSIS had assessed the anonymity of the online space allows individuals to post commentary that they would not normally say in public. Many of the posts in this space are best articulated as shit posting. Confirmation bias. Strategic analysis must be driven by direct evidence collection and assessments, as opposed to a reliance on social media posting, lacks context, and where the poster bias may not be considered. So that had been given to you by CSIS, and do you not agree with that?
I believe that it is an analysis done by an analyst, and that is the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. When I see social media posts growing in number and aggressiveness of language that says somebody should kill the PM or somebody should kill the DPM, I have reason to be concerned beyond what the analyst is concerned about.
Okay. So I'm just going to run over very briefly what I understand your position is, and your position as National Security Advisor. I've managed to find the policy with respect to your position. So if you can agree with the following, this is what you are to do. The National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister and Associate Secretary to Cabinet assists the clerk and provides information, advice, and recommendations to the Prime Minister as follows. As Associate Secretary to Cabinet, he or she can act on the clerk's behalf on any of the policy and operational issues that come before the Privy Council. As National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, he or she ensures the effective coordination of Canada's security and intelligence community, and together with the Deputy Ministers of National Defence, is responsible for the communication security establishment. The National Security Advisor also oversees the provisions of intelligence assessments to the Prime Minister, other ministers, and senior government officials. The National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister is supported by 2 secretariats via the Foreign and Defense Policy Advisors to the Prime Minister, Security and Intelligence, and International Assessment Staff. That's what your job is.
That's an old version of the job description. There's been some changes to it since then, but sure.
Right. But you are not in the business, or your department is not supposed to be in the business of actually collecting intelligence yourself.
We don't collect intelligence ourselves.
But I thought you'd said that it was looked at, you were setting up your own bureau or what have you to look at online rhetoric and do your own open source intelligence.
What I said is that there is no one doing that in a broad sense. I saw it as a gap. I need to do something about it. I don't have the legal mandate right now to do it. The OSINT document you saw previously is all obtained through legal means as an analysis. What we need is we need a unit in PCO or public safety that is more akin to the Foreign Intelligence Assessment Unit that takes covert and overt information and makes assessments. We don't have that domestically. It is a gap. I don't have a solution for it yet, and I won't be the sole person who decides whether it happens or not, but it is something that we need to look at, and I'm exploring. That's my
But
job.
why would you need that outside of the civil service, who are governed by legislation that collect intelligence?
It would be part of the civil service, just like the Foreign Intelligence Assessment Unit is part of the civil service.
Right, but the Foreign Intelligence Service, like the International Assessment Staff and Foreign Intelligence Service, you had the information from them, I take it, when the cabinet made this decision, did you not?
They were assessing foreign intelligence, not
Okay.
domestic intelligence,
And domestic intelligence was being assessed by the RCMP,
who assess also foreign intelligence,
right? CSIS,
who also assess foreign intelligence,
the Canadian Security Intelligence
who
Staff,
also assess foreign intelligence.
and they also look at domestic intelligence.
Some of them do, CSE does not. So just as those units all have mandates to collect and do some assessment, we see that raw intelligence and we make assessments of it on the foreign side. I would like an equivalent on the domestic side. I don't have that now. I believe it is a gap.
So why is what the RCMP does already doing that with their reports? They have 2 sets. They have the IMVE assessments online. They have the onset assessments online. Why is that not good enough for you?
Because I would like to look at, just as we do with foreign intelligence, all the various pieces in totality rather than institution by institution. It's part of our job to give a holistic picture.
And it's your job, according to this description, to effectively coordinate all that anyway.
Right, but I need to have people with the mandate to do that assessment, which is, I coordinate the function and the issues, the issues management of what's going on in the national security community, but not necessarily their intelligence assessment.
How about this? What if they just got rid of your position and left it to the director of CSIS to do what you do?
So the director of CSIS is not the only person who is responsible for security in this country. That's number one. You can certainly make that recommendation to the governor and council if it's useful to you, but there are more people than him involved in assessing national security in this country.
But it's nothing passed by Parliament, right? Parliament
The Privy
decides.
Council office is an established office that is essentially the Prime Minister's department. We coordinate information, we challenge, we provide policy advice to the Prime Minister, and I am part of that mechanism.
I understand that, but you can agree that Parliament has given you no mandate to do that with respect to intelligence.
I don't agree with how you framed it.
Parliament? So
I
there's-
don't agree with the basic premise of your challenge.
Well, here you go, yes or no. Has Parliament, via statute, given you, the National Security Advisor and the Privy Council, authority to collect and then analyze intelligence?
The Foreign Intelligence and Assessment Group is a longstanding group that, no, Parliament hasn't given it authority, but it exists and it continues.
Okay, next is the City of Ottawa, please.
Good afternoon, Ms. Thomas. My name's Ann Tardif. I'm one of the lawyers representing the City of Ottawa. You discussed the IRG, or Incident Response Group, this afternoon,
Yes, yes,
and I heard that that's a committee of cabinet that also includes officials who are subject matter experts. Is that correct?
yes,
And it's chaired by the Prime Minister.
it is.
And its purpose, if I understood you correctly, is to make quick, rapid decisions. Let's just go with rapid decisions about issues of national importance or crises,
Yes,
including COVID.
yes,
And you gave a number of other examples, right?
I did.
And it's the committee that is the most effective in dealing with crises.
Yes,
And my understanding is it met first on February 10th.
it did.
And that was, of course, day 13 of the convoy here in Ottawa. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think, as you mentioned earlier, we were in fact going into our third weekend in Ottawa. Fair?
Yes,
And the commission has heard some evidence that, in fact, weekends were more volatile. Is that right?
correct.
At least in Ottawa. I'm just
Yes.
talking about Ottawa.
Yes.
Okay. And commission counsel took you to the minutes of that IRG meeting. I won't turn them up, but I'll give the reference for the record. It's ssm.nsc.can.50209. And you had reported, if you need me to turn it up, I will, but you had reported that in Ottawa, the situation at that time remained largely unchanged. Do you recall that?
I do.
So the reason then that the IRG was convened at that point was not because something new or something had changed in Ottawa. Fair?
Fair.
And, you're perhaps seeing where I'm going here. I'm assuming it had something to do with the blockade in Windsor and perhaps concerns about other protest activity outside of Ottawa, in addition to what was going on in Ottawa.
That's a fair comment. The clerk of the Privy Council, Jan Charette, decided that briefing a group of ministers who are largely the ministers in the responsible departments for the national picture, and the cabinet committee, SSE, which was meeting quite regularly, while they had been effective, it was now time for an IRG and the Prime Minister to direct in a different way.
Right. And just to sort of close a loop on this, the SSE committee had met, I think it's 3 times prior to February 10th, correct?
Yes, correct.
And the decision to invoke or convene, pardon me, the IRG represents an escalation of the federal government's response. Is that fair?
I would say that's fair, but it's best raised with the clerk of the Privy Council.
Understood, and we'll do that then. Thank you. The other document I want to take you, or I guess the only document I'll take you to is, these are the, I can put it up if I need to, but in the interest of time, I can maybe just put it to you. I was going to take you to the minutes of the cabinet meeting of February 13th, and your mention of a breakthrough. Do you want me to put it up? I'm happy to. No? Okay. Can you just tell us what you were referring to?
I was referring to the reports of a negotiation between the mayor and convoy organizers.
Okay. And can we then turn up pb.nsc.can.403245? And bear with me, Ms. Thomas, this is the last document I'll take you to, the only and the last. So these are talking points that Commissioner Lucky sent to you and Minister Mendicino on February 14th, correct?
Correct.
And if we scroll down to page 3, Mr. Clerk, thank you. Yep, moving back to auto. If we scroll down a little further, down. There we go. This is the agreement, I take it, that was being reported and that you're referring to in the last 2 bullets. Now we're at the 14th. I appreciate we're the day after cabinet, but this is the same agreement, right? And if I won't read it, but that's what's described there in those bullets.
Yes.
The last 2 bullets on page 3. And scrolling down to page 4, Mr. Clerk, There's the rest of the description, just in fairness to you, Ms. Thomas, that's the agreement,
Yes.
right? Okay. And you'll see there the final bullet on the page, well, the third bullet from the top. While this is a step, this being the agreement in the right directions in terms of reducing the truckers' footprint and impact on Ottawa, it is not a win. That's what Commissioner Lucky was reporting to you, right?
Yes.
And do I understand that to mean it's a step in the right direction, but it's not a win, it's not going to bring the whole convoy to an end? Is that what you understood?
Yes.
Excuse me for interrupting. I just want to be clear. If you go back to the top of page 1, we have an issue again with the date stamp. You said February 14th, but if we subtract the 5 hours, it's the evening of the 13th.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. I confess I've never quite gotten that Greenwich time down. So, Ms. Thomas, you understood what your counsel said, so I apologize if I misled you. I'm not great with the time change. Thank you, counsel. And the last point I want to take you to is that final bullet. Commissioner Lucky reports, this agreement complements the plan to reduce the footprint through the work of the public liaison team, integrated command planners, and that's a reference to the integrated command planners in Ottawa, correct?
Correct.
Need to now incorporate this development into their resource and enforcement plan. And that's the information you had in the breakthrough, potential breakthrough, to the extent you were aware of it. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thomas. Those are my questions.
Okay, next, the OPS, please.
Good afternoon, Ms. Thomas. My name is David Michikowski, and I'm counsel to the Ottawa Police Service. I understand that as the, I'll use the acronyms because it's shorter, as the NSIA, it's your job to assess information and to advise the Prime Minister and to coordinate the flow of intelligence and information from federal agencies to the Prime Minister and to the Privy Council. Is that right?
Yes.
And in looking through the documents, and I'm happy to call it up if it's necessary, but I don't think it's contentious, there's a message from Zita Estravis to Bill Blair, I believe. Are you familiar with Zita Estravis?
I am.
And is that his chief of staff?
Yes, she is.
And so I think what she indicates, and this is on January 25th, is that the ADMs are meeting on the trucker convoy. And then she says that the NSIA is proactively engaged in hill security and that Intersect will be holding a call on January 27th. Do you agree with that?
I do.
And then if we could call up, Mr. Clerk, pb.nac.can.50577. There is a report on January 27th in which you asked for an update. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
And in that report, if we just look at the first paragraph or the second paragraph, it indicates that all key stakeholders, so that includes the RCMP, the OPP, OPS, PPS, various other entities, are actively planning and collaborating to ensure public safety. You'd agree with that?
I would.
And in the second paragraph, we see that it is also, it's planned to be a peaceful demonstration. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you can take that down. Thank you very much. And I understand there was an ITAC report on January 26th. And again, I won't turn it up unless you need to see it, but it is ts.nsc.can 50156. That ITAC report notes that the majority of the truckers are exercising their right to peaceful protest. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then there is another ITAC report, I believe, the following day, which is pb.can 401237. And it indicates at that point, so this is January 27th, that a dedicated group could prolong that protest until January 31st. Do you recall that?
I do recall it.
And it's still, however, expected to be peaceful, although recognizing that some extreme views of a vocal minority are on social media advocating, correct?
Correct.
And then there's an intersect meeting on January 27th. So the OPP, RCMP, PPS. Intersect's purpose is to collaborate on emergency preparedness and to provide situational awareness.
Correct.
And so I could turn up the report if you need to see it, but I see in that Intersect report, and maybe you can confirm, that we do see in that report that the plan is the trucks are going to be on Kent Street, they're going to be on Metcalfe, they're going to be on Wellington. You're aware of that from the Intersect report?
I was.
In a memo you received on January 28th, you again expressed, and I guess this is on the Friday, that the organizers of the protest had at that point expressed the intent for a peaceful event, correct?
I expressed that, or it was sent to me?
It was expressed to you, I'm sorry.
Yes, correct.
And on January 26th, so going back 2 days previously, Mr. McDonald reports to you, is that correct?
He does.
He indicated to you that in terms of public communication, that public communication was taking its cues from the Prime Minister and emphasizing the lawful nature of protest.
Yes, I remember reading that.
Right. And so there'd be no basis at that point for law enforcement to stop the protest at that stage, correct?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And on February 1st, you gave a talk to something called Canada and the World Committee.
Yes, so that's the partner committee to the Safety, Security, and Emergency Management meeting, where it looks at policy and emerging issues, essentially about Canadian foreign and defense policy.
Okay, and I see at that talk, which was on February 1st, that even though you indicate there's some disturbing behavior that you've now seen, you noted that the protest had largely remained peaceful and that all levels of law enforcement had worked together with federal officials to ensure planning for a safe protest, and that national security would continue to work closely with law enforcement. Is that right? I want to move on and talk about negotiation and de-escalation as a method of resolving protests and demonstrations. And the Commission took you to a memo from Mike MacDonald to you. And in that memo, the question was asked, and this was on January 25th, as to whether MPs should meet with the convoy while in Ottawa, and whether it was safe, and if there was advice for them. Do you remember that memo?
I do remember that memo.
And that question wasn't answered at that time as to whether MPs should meet with them, correct?
Correct, and partly because it was not for ADM NSOPs to make that determination broadly.
And you would agree with me that sometimes enforcement action can have undesirable results, correct?
It has, yes.
If we could turn up ssm.nsc.can 50292. And if we turn to page 5, that was the cabinet, the SSE meeting.
Yes.
And so you'll see on page 5 Number 6, if we scroll down. Yes, thanks very much. You'll see it was brought to your attention, this is on February 3rd, that the Ottawa Police said that they could not bring the protest to a conclusion without the assistance of the federal government due to public safety concerns and risks that enforcement would provoke some protesters, correct?
Yes.
And at that meeting on page 6 then, item 4, you had indicated that the protest organizations have indicated an interest in negotiations, but no one had reached out to them, correct?
Correct.
And then on page 8, there was a chart with a list of various options. And one of the things we see in the third box on the left-hand side is engagement with protesters and the question of a dedicated minister. So this is on February 3rd that's raised, correct?
A dedicated minister amongst others.
Right.
Certainly not as the only option.
Right, to engage with them. And then if we go then to the February 6 SSE meeting, and again, I won't turn it up in the interest of time, but if you need it, do let me know. I see at the February 6 meeting, there's a reference to the deputy minister reiterating the views of provincial colleagues that negotiation is the preferred option for resolution. Do you recall that?
I do.
And you participated then in a call with the city and the federal officials that and Chief Slowly that the commission took you to earlier this afternoon. And there was a discussion about negotiation resolving the situation at Confederation Park rather than going tactical. Do you remember that?
I do.
And you expressed enthusiasm that a tactical takedown was avoided by negotiations, correct?
Yes.
And the commission took you to your talking points on February 8th. And I see at that, in those talking points, that the mayor of Ottawa had requested that the Prime Minister of Canada appoint a mediator. Do you recall that?
I do.
And when I looked at the IRG minutes of February 10th, I saw that Public Safety Canada reported on a conversation with the lead OPP negotiators that raised the possibility of the protesters leaving and denouncing the blockades in exchange for a commitment to register their message with the government. Do you recall that?
I recall it being said, yes.
And that came up again, I saw at the IRG in the tracker of February 12th. In fact, you're shown as the lead to engage a federal interlocutor at that meeting, correct?
I don't recall being the lead, but certainly Deputy Minister Stewart was leading the discussions. Who would be the interlocutor? Names were put forward. I don't think I was ever identified as the single lead.
I just need another 3 minutes, I believe, to finish off this point.
Yes, if you didn't go over the same documents with each witness and focused on key, that might shorten your time, but I'll let you go.
I'm doing my best. And so you indicated that there wasn't an interlocutor. And one of the things that you mentioned to my friends earlier this afternoon was that the negotiations in Windsor had failed, correct?
Correct.
And when I looked at the document, and I won't take you up to it, but it is pbnsc.can 402963, I see that Deputy Minister Stewart at that time told Mr. Mendocino that it failed in Windsor because it was given to them late at night and the enforcement was starting the next morning, correct?
That is what Deputy Stewart said and is in that memo.
And so I just want to take you to one last document. And it was a timeline that had been provided by, I believe it would have been prepared by DOJ. Do you recall that timeline?
I can't tell you that I recall the specific one you're referring to. We had multiple timelines.
And so when I looked at that timeline, there was a space on it for meetings, and I'll show you the timeline just to make it easier. It's pbnsc.can. I'm sorry, I'm giving you the wrong document number for the timeline. The timeline had two columns on it, and it had a column that said meetings, and then it had federal decisions. Do you remember that?
I don't recall the document you're speaking of.
Okay. And when I looked at that document, and it started prior to the convoy, and it went right up until past the emergency. And what I saw on the right-hand side was lots of meetings, dozens of meetings with various committees. But when I looked at and you'd agree that that occurred?
Yes.
And when I looked at the column that said federal decisions, pages 1 to 21, although there were dozens and dozens of meetings and suggestions about a federal mediator or a negotiator, none of that ever happened. And the only federal decisions that took place from the start of the convoy to February 14th were on January 28th, government buildings were locked down. The airspace over Parliament on January 29th was closed. And on January 29th, a request by Ottawa Police to use a parking lot at Cartier Drill Hall was approved. And on February 3rd, a request for RCMP resources was approved. And that's it until the Emergencies Act.
That doesn't reflect the significant amount of engagement, consultation, work with provinces, Ontario in the particular case of Ottawa, which is what you're concerned about, to try and enforce provincial law, the Highway Traffic Act, as an example. And so it wasn't achieved, which is part of the problem.
Right. And so the one thing that the protesters wanted was a meeting with somebody in the federal government. They have that meeting in this process, but they never got that meeting before passing the Emergencies Act. Is that right?
And as was discussed earlier, the reasons why were explained.
Okay. Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Okay, next, if I could call on the CCLA, please.
Good afternoon, Ms. Thomas. Can you see and hear me okay?
I can't really hear you.
Okay. How about now?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. My name is Kara Zwiebel. I am counsel for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. If I could get the clerk to put up just the witness summary, WTS 6071, and go to page 11. I don't know if we'll need to refer to this, but just so you have it in front of you. Your view as articulated in your witness summary is that the reference to the CSIS definition in the Emergencies Act should be reconsidered. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And in your witness summary, there's a statement that the CSIS definition requires the existence of a known actor carrying out activities in support of the threat of violence against persons or property, correct?
A known actor or group, yes.
Okay. And your colleague, Assistant Secretary McDonald, said that in order for the 2C definition to be met, CSIS targets would have to move from using rhetoric.
You've cut out, you're freezing. Oh, we'll have to get her back.
I'm sorry, are you there? I've lost the picture of the.
Okay. Okay, you're now back.
Oh, okay, thank you, sorry. Is that a statement that you agree with?
The definition as into, yes, I think that it needs to be modernized. Just as the director of CSIS has indicated that the CCS Act needs to be modernized. That element does as well.
Okay, but the statement that in order for the 2C definition to be met, CCS targets would have to move from using rhetoric to inciting or carrying out serious violence, I'm going to suggest to you, is a misunderstanding of the CCS definition, because individuals can't be targets of CCS if they haven't already determined that there's been, if that 2C threshold, that threshold has been met. Would you agree with that?
I would.
Okay. And your view is that the CCS definition you've said before of threat to the security of Canada is very narrow.
Very narrow and outdated. I'm not saying
Okay,
it should
and
be
you-
broadened. I'm saying it should be modernized.
Okay,
But it
and
needs
because
to
you
be reviewed.
understand, sorry, not trying to interrupt you, because you understand why there should be a high threshold before the state can start engaging in surveillance of its citizens.
I don't disagree with that at all. I didn't say it should be broadened. I said it should be modernized.
Right, because expressing unpopular political views shouldn't be enough to engage the surveillance apparatus of the state.
And that's not what I've said.
Okay, and disagreement with the government should not be enough.
I agree.
But your view is that the Emergencies Act should have a broader definition of what constitutes a threat to the security of Canada. Is that right?
I think that both acts were written in the 1980s and they both need to be modernized to reflect the reality of the nature of threats that are occurring in 2022.
Okay, but again, you understand that in the case of the Emergencies Act, there are reasons why we would want a high threshold.
I'm not disagreeing with the threshold. I'm speaking about an act that was written 30 years ago that needs to be modernized to reflect the reality of the kinds of threats that exist in the world today.
Okay, and we'd want a high threshold because the Emergencies Act allows the government to bypass the parliamentary process and rule by executive order, at least for a brief period of time.
Right, but does allow for all the transparency of going through the parliamentary process and for processes like this one. So
Right.
I am not saying that the government should have more expansive power or a lower threshold. I'm saying that the act should not sit 30 years untouched.
Okay, there's no disagreement there. I mean, I think we probably have different characterizations of what's a high threshold. You also understand, and maybe I'm not sure if this is the case. I was trying to follow your answers to my friend, Mr. Miller. But although you believe that the definition should be reconsidered in the Emergencies Act, you understand that currently the definition of a public order emergency in the Emergencies Act is tied exclusively and exhaustively to the definition in the CCS Act.
The federal government legal opinion is different, and there will be legal arguments to that end. I'm not the person to make that argument.
Okay. One other area I'd like to cover. Your office, you mentioned, is a consumer of intelligence, and you receive intelligence from CSIS, CSEC, ITAC, Global Affairs, Foreign Intelligence Partners, all of those.
Correct.
And in this case, I think there was also mention in the witness summary of receiving information from the CBSA, from Immigration and Refugee Citizenship Canada, from the Parliamentary Protective Services, and from the Department of National Defence.
I actually don't receive anything personally from Parliamentary Protective Services, but the rest are true.
Okay. On the IRG minutes that you were taken to earlier by Commission Counsel, that tracker, that was a place where you had identified this intelligence gap that you characterized it as, and it said there, open source, non-criminal, non-terrorist. So I just want to put a proposition to you, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree. And that proposition is this, that the difference between a society where individuals are monitored by the state, where there are no grounds to believe that they are going to engage in criminal or terrorist activity, and one where they are not, is the difference between a surveillance state and a free society. Is that a proposition that you would agree with?
Well, that's exactly what I've said, that we need to understand trends, but we don't need to understand, we need to anonymize that information so that we're not tracking individuals. So I agree with you. I just think that we have to have an understanding of growing threats that are not yet at a threshold or potential that they're under a CSIS investigation or a criminal investigation. That when there is something like a convoy, as we saw here in Ottawa, and there is open source information that we're going to target a school and we're going to do a slow roll around the school, and that information maybe is being monitored by the police so they can do something. I don't actually know, but there needs to be an understanding that the individual said that isn't under a criminal investigation. We're not even sure that the behavior is criminal, but it says something about what is happening in the middle of a crisis or an incident. I don't want to know who said it, and I need a legal framework to do this. So it's not monitoring, it's not individuals, it's understanding trends, just as we do with foreign intelligence. And so I would like to agree with what you're saying, but I don't actually agree with your framing of it.
Okay.
In terms of what I am proposing is required.
Okay.
Okay, you're well out of time, so you're going to have to wrap up.
Okay. No, that's fine. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Next, call on the counsel for former Chief Slowly.
Good evening. Rebecca Jones for counsel for former Chief Slowly. Ms. Thomas, am I right that your very impressive experience does not include experience within a police department?
Like all of my predecessors, that's true.
And so that means that you don't have specific experience figuring out resource requests for public order operations, for example?
No, I would rely on experts for that information if I required it, and I'm not sure I would.
Right, okay. And that's exactly what I was going to say, is that you would rely on experts such as the RCMP or your colleagues in public safety, emergency preparedness, that sort of thing for that information.
Correct.
Okay. And you've testified about the incredibly complex situation occurring in Ottawa, which you saw as a national security threat, right?
Yes.
And we've now heard a whole parade of witnesses who, while disagreeing on a lot, have all agreed on a couple things. First, that the protest was unlike anything they had ever seen, right?
Correct.
And second, that the OPS did not have the resources they required to end this occupation until around February 17th.
Correct.
Okay. And the commissioner of the OPP testified that ultimately over 2,000 officers were required to end the occupation, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, what I want to do with my time with you is to explore resource requests and specifically what the federal government through you understood about the resources that were being provided to the RCMP, by the RCMP to the OPS and Chief Slowly. So if we can pull up, please, OPS 6093. And if we can go to page 4, please. So this is an email from Chief Slowly to the commissioner of the RCMP. And if we scroll down on February 2nd, I should have said, and then if we scroll down, we see a request to the RCMP for 50 uniformed members, a level of leadership to provide support for teams, and 3 public order units, right?
Yes.
And if we scroll up, we'll see that Commissioner Lucky advised Chief Slowly in the first paragraph there that she had reviewed the request with her team, but that the RCMP was experiencing a draw on their resources and were not able to provide that assistance, right?
That's what the letter says, yes.
Okay. And if we scroll up, we'll see that by the 3rd, it was still the case. If you go all the way up, well, in any event. It says that by the 3rd, those resources still hadn't been provided and there had been no promise to provide them.
That's what the email says.
Okay. And were you following this?
Not in this level of detail at all, nor have I ever seen this. So,
Okay.
yes, I'm reading what's said and agreeing with you.
Perfect. And so that's what I want to know. You would have been relying on the RCMP to be dealing with these resource requests and then briefing you.
Yes.
Okay.
And the Deputy Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Public Safety, in fact, more than me.
Right. Everyone would be relying on the RCMP with respect to these resource requests. Yes. Okay. I'm not going to pull it up in the interest of time, but on February 3rd in the evening, Minister Mendicino tweets that the RCMP has approved all additional officers requested. And we heard evidence. Have you watched the evidence of the RCMP yesterday?
As much as I could.
Okay. And we heard from Deputy Commissioner Duhaime of the RCMP that there was a mix-up, that those officers that were requested, there was a statement made that 250 officers had been provided by the RCMP, but that was a mix-up. Did you hear that evidence?
I did not hear that evidence.
Okay. And we also heard evidence from Commissioner Lucky that until after February 2nd, the number of RCMP members deployed to Ottawa did not go above 50 or 60 officers.
I did not hear her say that.
Okay. At the time that, leading up to, let's say, the period of the mayor's letter requesting the 1,800 resources on February 7th, leading up to that time, is it fair to say that you were under the impression from your colleagues at the RCMP that all of the resource requests being made by the OPS were being fulfilled?
I can't say that unequivocally. We knew that the RCMP was stretched. They had resources that they had to redeploy from across the country to Ottawa, and they also had responsibility for their protective units. So I would need the numbers in front of me exactly and to recreate data to be able to answer that unequivocally. I'm willing to say that there was confusion about the number of RCMP provided.
Right. And I'm not asking you to actually comment on the deployment levels, but rather the understanding of the government, as we saw in Minister Mendicino's tweet, that everything that OPS was asking for from the RCMP had been fulfilled.
In that I don't know the conversation between Commissioner Lucky and Minister Mendicino, I'd prefer not to comment.
Okay. Okay. So why don't we move forward then to the mayor's letter. We don't need to pull it up. You're familiar with the letter requesting the 1,800 officers, right?
Right.
And the following day, you briefed cabinet. And if we can pull up SSM NSC CAN 246, please. So this is the day after the resource request. And if we look at the 4th bullet, this is your briefing. You say the chief continues to communicate publicly his view that OPS lacks resources to effectively manage the situation. This may be somewhat true, but may also be a strategic tactic. So I want to just break that down. This may be somewhat true. We can now agree that it was true that the chief required those resources, correct?
Correct. At the time this was written, I would not necessarily have seen that letter because it didn't come to me.
The letter about the resources that were being requested. Okay, so when you're commenting on the OPS lacking resources and you're saying it may be somewhat true, what I'm asking you now is you'll acknowledge now that you know it was entirely true that the OPS lacked those resources.
I know in retrospect for the size the convoy grew to and the way it became entrenched in the city, Chief Slowly did not have the resources to manage it.
Perfect. And then you say it may also be a strategic tactic. And I take it that that wasn't something you arrived at yourself. It was something that you were being briefed on?
Yes, that's correct.
And who briefed you on that?
The commissioner of the RCMP.
Okay. So she told you that the request for resources may be a strategic tactic.
Correct.
Okay. Can we agree that this kind of communication to cabinet would lead cabinet and federal government officials to question what the OPS was asking for in terms of resource requests?
Without betraying what was discussed in cabinet, I think that ministers were very open to understanding what OPS's needs were.
Right, but we'll see that what they're being briefed on is that this request might be somewhat true, but might be a tactic.
And that was the thought at the time.
Right. And we now know that was incorrect.
Correct.
Okay. And then you testified a moment ago that you weren't really sure what the RCMP was saying in terms of whether they had fulfilled all resource requests. We now know that there was the request for the 1,800 on February 7th. And what I'm curious about is that there are multiple times after that date where the RCMP was still indicating that it had provided all resources that the OPS had requested. Do you remember that?
I actually can't say that unequivocally.
Okay, so why don't we quickly pull up SSM, NSC, CAN 209. So we've looked at this a couple of times today. This is the February 10th incident response group meeting. And if we go to page 5, if you look at the first big paragraph right in the middle, you see the sentence, the RCMP has provided all resources requested by the OPS.
That's what I would have been briefed.
Right, and that's all I'm asking is, does that refresh your recollection that you were still being briefed after the mayor's letter, that the RCMP had provided all of the resources that the OPS had requested?
I can agree with that. What I can't say is that I knew about the mayor's letter or saw it at the time.
That's a different issue.
Okay.
Different issue.
But so I couldn't see them. I can't. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Okay. We're agreeing.
We're agreeing. You were not doing your own assessment about whether or not OPS had all the resources they asked for. You were relying on the RCMP.
Correct.
And the RCMP is still telling you on the 10th that they are providing all of the resources that the OPS requested.
Correct.
Okay. And
My one question would be, did the OPS request 1,700 or 1,800 resources of the RCMP or of police support writ large? And I don't know the answer to that.
And the answer, and I can tell you the answer to that, was from both federal policing and provincial and municipal policing.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Next is the Democracy Fund, JCCF.
Hi, Ms. Thomas. I'm Rob Kittredge, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I only have 10 minutes with you today, and I'm going to try and cover a fair amount of territory. So to the extent possible, if you can give me yes or no questions or yes or no answers, that would be very helpful. Obviously, answer where you have to, but if we can plow through this, that would be great. I imagine your job comes with a pretty high-level security clearance. Would it be fair to say that there's no intelligence information that Cabinet or the PM is cleared to see that you can't see?
That's true.
You attended the incident response group meetings where the invocation of the Emergencies Act was considered and regularly briefed the PM on national security issues during the period leading up to the invocation of the Act, right?
Yes.
You would know about any protest-associated acts or threats of serious violence that Cabinet, the IRG, and the Prime Minister knew about when they were considering whether to invoke the Emergencies Act, right?
As I've said earlier, not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Right.
All
So I'm cleared to see everything. That's different than seeing everything.
Okay. Cabinet, the IRG, and the Prime Minister were aware that CSIS had determined that the protests didn't pose a threat to the security of Canada, as that term is defined in the CSIS Act.
In the very narrow confines of the CSIS Act.
Right. Cabinet, the IRG, and the Prime Minister were aware that CSIS was concerned that invoking the Emergencies Act risked further inflaming IMVE rhetoric and could give rise to a risk of serious rhetoric. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that was a responsible act to do that analysis by CSIS.
You're not aware of any acts of serious violence associated with the protests in Ottawa or at border crossings, are you?
It depends on the definition of serious violence. There was continual violence in the streets of Ottawa, but there wasn't anything that you could point to like January 6th.
And I mean, when you say continual violence, what kind of level of violence are you talking about?
As has been reported by the OPS and by the city and by the residents who have testified, harassment, people being followed, people being intimidated, the noise, the pollution, the mess.
Right, but not serious violence.
There were some incidents that were early reported, but I don't know if they, the outcome of them was directly related to the convoy participants or just the general atmosphere in downtown at that point in time.
Okay, but you can't point me to an example of an incident of serious violence.
Not serious violence.
All right. There wasn't any espionage associated with the protests or blockades, was there?
That's already been established, no.
Right. And there wasn't any sabotage?
Not as it's defined in the CSIS Act.
Right. And CSIS found no indication of foreign state interference at the protests, and you don't have any reason to disagree with their assessment, do you?
No.
Okay. Your interview summary says the National Security and Intelligence Advisor assesses intelligence and advises the Prime Minister on national and international threats to the security of Canada. When you use the term threats to the security of Canada there, that's used in a general sense and not in the restrictive sense set out in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, right?
It's in a broad sense.
Right. In other words, in your role as National Security and Intelligence Advisor, you're not governed by the CSIS Act.
The information I receive from CSIS is.
Sure, but your assessment of what a threat to the security of Canada isn't governed by the CSIS Act. You advise the Prime Minister on anything you consider to be a threat to the security of Canada, whether those threats meet the definition set out in Section 2 of the CSIS Act or not, right?
No, that is, you're misrepresenting. I would not brief on a threat where I did not have intelligence from one of the intelligence agencies that I had thoroughly discussed with the intelligence agencies.
Right, but what you consider a threat that's worth bringing to the attention of the Prime Minister might be something that doesn't strictly fall into the limited definition of Section 2 of the CSIS Act, right?
Yes, but it would be very much consulted with the heads of those agencies.
Sure, but you're not as restricted in scope as
not.
CSIS is. Okay. In the time leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, you felt that the protests in Ottawa and at border crossings constituted a threat to the security of Canada, right?
I did.
But not in the sense contemplated in Section 2 of the CSIS Act.
Correct.
All right. In your interview summary, you say that CSIS's legal mandate obliges it to assess threats to national security through a very narrow lens. Do you remember saying that?
I do.
And that narrow lens basically boils down to the definition of threat to the security of Canada as set out in Section 2, right?
No. CSIS is restricted in terms of the threshold they have to meet in order to open an investigation, to get a warrant, and pursue collecting intelligence. There are threats to Canada that are broader than that. Foreign interference is a threat to Canada, as an example. That doesn't fall under that definition of the CSIS Act.
Okay. If I'm understanding your testimony earlier, it's your opinion that the Emergencies Act doesn't require a Section 2 threat to the national security of Canada.
That's not what I said. I said that the public order emergency is assigned meaning by the CSIS Act, but is not restricted by the CSIS Act.
Right.
And so a public order emergency is broader than as defined by the CSIS Act.
So does a Section 2 CSIS Act threat to the security of Canada have to exist in order for a public order emergency to exist under the Emergencies Act?
Well, as we've seen, the answer to that, in my opinion, is no.
Okay. Well, I guess I'd like to walk you through the Emergencies Act and maybe see if I can persuade you that the answer is not no.
Well, as I said, you're going to receive legal arguments, and I'm not going to respond to you
Fair
in
enough.
terms of the legal view. You're a lawyer, I am not, and our lawyers will be making arguments.
Fair enough, but I just wanted to show you the section of the
I
act,
understand, I've read the
and-
section.
And we'll see where we get it.
Well, I've read the section.
Okay, but you don't mind my showing
Sure.
it to you, I imagine. All right, Mr. Clerk, can we pull up the Emergencies Act? It's CCF 047. When did you first read the Emergencies Act?
The Emergencies Act, when I arrived in PCO
Which would be when?
in January.
Okay. And when did you first read the CCS Act?
I haven't, 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Can you take us to the section of the Emergencies Act that defines a public order emergency?
I think it's further down.
Section 16.
There it is.
There we go. So if we look at the definition of public order emergency, can you read that to us, that paragraph that starts with public order emergency in bold?
You'd like me to read it?
Yes, please.
Public order emergency means an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada and that is so serious as to be a national emergency.
And the next paragraph?
Has the meaning assigned by Section 2 of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act.
Right. So on a plain reading, not a legal interpretation, but on a plain reading, doesn't that say to you that the circumstances that constitute the emergency have to arise from a Section 2
Excuse
threat
me.
to the security of Canada?
The witness has already said she's not going to interpret the act. She's not a lawyer.
I mean, it's a fairly plain English reading, but I suppose.
As a lawyer, if that's all it required, you'd know we'd be out of business. So,
Well, fair enough. Fair enough. All right.
you have 1 minute left, and so I'm just warning you that time's running out. So
Okay,
it's,
fair enough. I guess what beyond that definition would you say is a threat to the security of Canada?
There's a range of threats that need to be considered when you're talking about this country. Economic security, the threat of IMVE, the rhetoric of threats against public figures, the inability to conduct a livelihood in the city of Ottawa, as an example, at the Coutts border blockade, if we're going to speak about this specific example. The threat to public institutions and the undermining of the confidence in public institutions. Those things all constitute a threat.
Right, but those aren't mentioned in Section 2 of the
You asked me.
CCS Act.
You asked me what did, and I answered your question.
Right,
And the
and-
lawyers will talk about the
Okay,
CCS
but
Act.
those aren't mentioned in Section 2 of the CCS Act. All right, fair enough. Okay, well, thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Okay, next, the Windsor Police Service.
Tom McCrae, and I appear for the Windsor Police Service. Mr. Clerk, could you please turn up the witness statement 6071 WTS? Sorry, if you could go down to the top of page 8, please. Now, Ms. Thomas, is it correct, and I'm just, while the clerk does that, that you have been in the federal public service for the last 20 years at least?
At least.
Okay, thank you. At the top of this paragraph, it says NSIA Thomas reflected, and then it goes on, it could have been better. The sharing of information, for instance. Then ASC McDonald added that the implicated law enforcement agencies, OPS, SQ, OPP, WPS, and RCMP, maintain distinct intelligence silos. Is that a view that you hold, Ms. Thomas?
It is. It's improved since this convoy, but at the time, yes.
Your earlier evidence today, as I noted it, was that you were aware of Operation Hendon. Isn't that correct?
I was made aware of Operation Hendon after the convoy. I found out that that ITAC and other elements of the federal national security community did see some of their reports, but I didn't, not directly.
Are you aware that, in fact, the Hendon reports to Project Hendon was a sharing of information, at least amongst OPS, WPS, and the OPP?
I am now, yes.
Okay. So they're not truly distinct intelligence silos, isn't that correct?
It depends on where they're shared and how they're used.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. That's all of my questions. I would like to throw the balance of my time, if possible, to the City of Windsor, please.
That's a new arrangement. So I'll take it under advisement. City of Windsor.
Hopefully, we can have those extra 2 or 3 minutes. Good evening. My name is Jennifer King. I'm legal counsel to the City of Windsor. I would like to start with the issue of the line between a lawful and unlawful protest. If Mr. Clerk could please bring up Win 50511. This is the February 11th injunction order granted in Windsor. You were aware of this order at the time?
I was.
Okay, if you could please scroll to the bottom of page 2, paragraph 4. And here, the court ordered that the defendants and any persons having notice of this order are hereby restrained and enjoined from impeding or blocking access to the Ambassador Bridge and indirect or direct approaching roadways and access points for 10 days from the date of this order. So you'll agree with me that this order was made effective February 11th at 7 p.m., Ms. Thomas. So when the order became effective, any person having notice of this order who continued to impede or block access to the bridge would contravene the order, right?
Yes.
And disobeying a court order, you're aware that that is contrary to the Criminal Code, Section 127?
I wasn't aware of the section, but yes.
Okay. And you're aware that protesters continued to impede and block access to the bridge after 7 p.m. on February 11th?
Yes.
Does this inform your assessment of whether the Ambassador Bridge blockade was a lawful protest, at least after this order became effective?
Well, it would have been an unlawful protest.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, could you please bring up PB CAN 401661? I understand from your witness summary that you spoke with the U.S. Homeland Security Advisor on February 9th and 10th.
I did.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
So this is an email from Martin Loken. Who's Martin Loken?
Martin Loken at that time was a deputy to the ambassador in Washington, to our ambassador.
Thank you. So it appears that Mr. Loken sent this email to you before one of these calls with the U.S. Homeland Security Advisor. Do you recall this email?
I do now. I don't recall it from the time. I've seen it.
And you'll see partway through the page, he suggests some additional messaging, and I'll just take you to the third bullet. And he says, critical that CBSA and CBP work together with relevant police of jurisdiction to ensure traffic keeps moving. Do you agree with that message and convey that message to the U.S. Homeland Security Advisor at the time?
Yes.
Okay, and then continuing on that bullet, recognize that international crossings are a national security issue. Do you understand what Mr. Loken meant here?
Yes, I do. That the economic viability of the country is a national security issue, and it's considered that on both sides of the border.
And you agree with that assessment?
I do.
Is that something you conveyed to the U.S. Homeland Security Advisor at the time?
It wasn't, I did not need to convey it. She raised it.
Okay. And you both agreed that it was
We
a
did.
national security issue?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm showing you a lot of documents, and hopefully I'll get through it quickly. So if you could please pull up SSM CAN. I'm not sure if I've got this right. It's 402694, Mr. Clerk. What I want to show you is that the next day on February 11th, you participated in an opposition leaders briefing. Do you recall that?
I do.
Okay. So that's not it. Oh, no, there it is. Yes, it is. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. So if you could just go to page 2 in the middle of the page, you gave an update on the Ambassador Bridge blockade. You recall that? A little bit farther down, Mr. Clerk. You'll see it says ON there. Okay. So you state there, all 3 levels working together on this. Are you referring to 3 levels of government there?
Yes. This is somebody's notes of what I said, rather than verbatim transcript, but yes.
But that's what you said, that all 3 levels of government were working together on that the issue of the Ambassador Bridge?
Yes.
Okay, and if you continue on in that paragraph, working with U.S. federal, state, municipal communication is good. So it's your understanding that the federal government was getting the information that it required from Windsor?
We were getting some information from Windsor. We were getting some information from the United States. And then the policing information you would have to speak to Commissioner Leckie about. But in terms of working collectively with the 2 border agencies on both sides of the border, along with Homeland Security and the White House, people were working well. They had the same goal, and it was opening that bridge as quickly as possible.
Okay, and Mr. Clerk, if you could scroll down to just under the redactions on that page. So at the bottom of the page. So you're referring to questions about jurisdiction being constant here. But that this was not a question or concern or an issue at the operational level, at least in Windsor. Are you aware, would you agree that any questions about jurisdictional issues did not impact the operational response of the police and local authorities on the ground in Windsor?
I agree with that. But there were issues, jurisdictional issues that CBSA was bringing to our attention. The city versus who is accountable for the port of entry. And I think that Mr. Zosky spoke about that yesterday, as did Mr. Keenan.
As far as you're aware, there was no delay or operational issues with the response due to these questions that arose?
I can't say that unequivocally, no.
Okay. I think this will probably be my final question. So in your witness summary, you state that the primary goal of the decision to invoke the Act was to provide local and provincial police forces with additional policing authorities that would allow them to manage copycat protests and blockades in their jurisdictions. Are you aware of any consultation with the local police forces and municipalities with respect to the authorities required to manage the protests and blockades in their jurisdictions?
I'm not aware, but I was not a part of the consultation outside the federal government.
Well, would you agree with me that it would have been useful to consult with the police, including police of jurisdiction and local authorities, to get information about what would be useful on the ground?
Yes, I would agree.
Thank you. Those are my questions. And thank you for the indulgence, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. Next is the National Police Federation.
Hello, Lauren Pierce for the National Police Federation. Our questions have been canvassed by the previous parties. We have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. The Government of Saskatchewan.
Thank you. Good evening, Ms. Thomas. My name is Mike Morris, and I'm counsel for the Government of Saskatchewan. Ms. Thomas, I understand that you were only about 2 weeks into your role as NSIA when the Freedom Convoy rolled into Ottawa. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That meant you were effectively having to learn your role while in the thick of it. Is that fair?
That's fair.
And I think you've stated that as NSIA, you are essentially a consumer of intelligence provided to you by other agencies such as the RCMP and CSIS, correct?
Amongst others, yes.
Right. What I want to touch upon is your request for a threat assessment from the RCMP on February 14th. Commission Counsel raised this with you and drew your attention to an email which was titled Urgent from Mike McDonald to the RCMP, indicating you needed a threat assessment for the clerk of the Privy Council. Do you recall that?
I do.
So I'm just going to ask the registrar to pull up PB NSC CAN 403462. And the reason I'm pulling this up, ma'am, is because I think you actually did get a response to that threat assessment, and I just want to give you the opportunity to see that.
Yeah, I remember the document. It was incomplete and certainly not, it was going to be incorporated into a broader document that was attached to the invocation material. And so this is a part of a response.
Okay, because if we just scroll down, we can see there's information provided by Adriana Polaz from the RCMP to Mike McDonald at 2:25 p.m., correct?
Yes.
And she says, Mike has requested, please let me know if this suits your requirements. And below that, of course, is obviously what is the RCMP assessment on the convoy. I'd just like us to scroll up then again back to the top, because it appears that you had some questions about this material, this assessment, and you had asked Mr. McDonald to convey them to the RCMP. Particularly, it looks like he's quoted from something you typed, which begins, I guess my question is, how do we know, in particular, how do we know that the majority are peaceful? And of course, there's some other stuff typed after that as well, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so that was a question that you wanted answered, and Mr. McDonald seems to be indicating that NSIA would like the question answered within the next 20 minutes. And if we just scroll up again so we can see the time of this email, it's 1952. So if we subtract 5 hours, I think that puts us at 2:52 p.m. on February 14th. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay. Do you know what time the first ministers' meeting was held on that day? I think it was 10:15 a.m.
I'll agree with you on that. I don't know offhand.
And did it go for around an hour or a little over an hour? Do you know?
I don't recall.
Okay. And I gather you do know that the Prime Minister had a press conference scheduled for February 14th for 4:30 p.m. Do you recall that?
I do.
And that at that press conference, of course, the Prime Minister announced that the Emergencies Act was being invoked, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I'm just trying to get a timeline. So basically, you were looking for some more information at approximately 2:52 p.m. You wanted it within the next 20 minutes, and there was a press conference scheduled that day for 4:30 p.m., correct?
Correct. I was asking questions to be more expansive, to ensure that we answered a broad range of questions.
And this was required for the clerk of the Privy Council, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You wouldn't have asked if you didn't think the clerk should have it, I assume, correct?
No, but as you would know, in government, we do a lot of preparatory staff work to answer eventualities. So I did not know at this point what the outcome was going to be of the Prime Minister's decisions. We were preparing for every eventuality.
Okay. You hadn't spoken with the Prime Minister between the first Minister's meeting and the announcement then at 4:30 p.m. Or sorry, no, I shouldn't go to the announcement. I should go to the time this email was sent.
I had not. There were other parts of PCO who were more engaged at that point because there was a different work that needed to be done. The Intergovernmental Affairs Group, as an example, rather than me. I'm not the Prime Minister's sole advisor.
I understand that. I just have one last question. There was reference to an email drafted by a person named Philippe Lafortune in the Privy Council office. Do you recall that?
I do.
Is that person a lawyer, do you know?
He is not. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. He was just essentially doing some legal research type work then. Is that fair?
Yeah, he was doing research. I wouldn't call it legal.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Those are my questions for you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is the Ontario Provincial Police.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hello, Ms. Thomas. My name is Janine Cabersi, and I'm one of the lawyers representing the Ontario Provincial Police in this hearing. I'd like to start by talking to you a bit about your role and the role of your office, and then some of the relationships and interactions that you have with the security and intelligence partners, as you've called them. So as stated, I believe in your witness summary, and it's also in the institutional report for the Privy Council office, you'd agree that you work closely with your security and intelligence partners, and that includes CSIS, the RCMP, the PPS, as well as CBSA and Transport Canada. That's sort of a foundational part of the work that you do.
I would say the PPS is not in that. The PPS is not in that core group.
Okay, fair enough. It's listed in the report, but
Mike McDonald deals with them more than I do.
Right. Okay. And you also, in your exchange with counsel for the CCF, I believe, you talked about always consulting with the lead intelligence agencies that you work with whenever you're in the process of advising the Prime Minister about a threat. You recall saying that just a short while ago?
I do.
You know, obviously reflecting your respect for the expertise and the work that those agencies do, which is in their area of specialization.
Well, it's more than expertise and respect. It's their legal authorities.
Right.
And mandates.
Right. Yeah, it's of course a very important part of the consideration. And so I expect that in your role as a consumer of intelligence, but not a producer of intelligence or investigations, as we've heard earlier today, that there's a regular communication that you're doing with these entities and agencies that have to provide the information that then becomes part of that information flow through your office, through to the cabinet and the Prime Minister, and perhaps others as well.
Correct.
Right. And I expect that in that working relationship that you have with these partner entities and agencies, that there's always an opportunity for some conversation about what you need as the NSIA, what they can provide to you. Is that
That's fair.
A fair expectation? Yeah.
Yes.
So considering some of what's been discussed earlier in terms of the scope of what your office is able to do, given as was raised in the questioning with Counsel for Freedom Corps, that you don't have any legislative framework for your work. I'd like to talk about, the current situation and how you deal with addressing the needs of your role through the entities that exist. So a first example, you've spoken about a concern that it seemed to me perhaps gave rise to this interest in doing more in the way of social media intelligence work. And I take it that to some extent the concern is related to potential threats to public figures, the Prime Minister, others in the cabinet, for example. That's one area of concern, I take it. Is that
That's
fair to say?
Yes.
Yes. And so my understanding is that currently, if there's a concern in that regard, that the RCMP has a National Security Criminal Investigations Office that would have responsibility for conducting threat assessments or perhaps doing an investigation. If you had a concern that you wanted to have a police agency look at, is that,
Yes.
am I correct?
Yes.
And in order to provide that day-to-day security for the Prime Minister, there's the Prime Minister's protective detail, and for others, there is the RCMP Protective Services currently fulfilling that function.
Correct.
Is that correct? And so in doing that job, it's an intrinsic part of their job to continually evaluate risks or threats to the figures that they're protecting.
Yes, on case-by-case events. And so what my concern is broader than that. The RCMP may tell you, and I'm giving you a number, it's not necessarily the correct number, that there were 5 actionable threats against the Prime Minister last year. And they investigated all of them. We have a concern in the intelligence and the security community at the deputy minister level, and certainly within PCO, about the rhetoric that is online. So 5 actionable threats that they investigate, and they may arrest somebody or they may warn somebody or do any of the things that police agencies do. But in fact, there's 1,000, maybe 1,500 threats of various nature that are going to affect other things that the Prime Minister does, that says something about the discourse and the concern out there. And so it is a nuanced thing to try to explain, but we have a responsibility to understand the country, and not on a case-by-case basis, on the mood, the tone. And some of that's intelligence, and some of it is other parts of the various arms of government. But I think that we are a little blind on what is going on in society. And we are, in terms of the Prime Minister's protection as an example, we are seeing a change in the environment that he is in. We're seeing an increased level of anger. And it's more than just him, it's other public officials as well. And we have a responsibility to understand that.
Right. I appreciate that. And one option that is available now at this point to investigate that concern, to take whatever steps might be necessary to address that concern, would be to refer that to the RCMP. Is that?
The RCMP will look at actionable intelligence. This is a different notion. It's a different need.
Oh.
And the RCMP, we can't send everything to the RCMP. They have their core functions to execute.
So I think I'm going to want, I think what you're talking about after, oh, okay. It just froze for a moment. I don't know if I froze for a moment, perhaps. But
For a
can
moment,
you hear me now?
but go ahead.
Thomas?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that.
You have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So I'm going to move through this more quickly then, and then get back to the point that you were making, Ms. Thomas, about really the big picture and your concern about the big picture. In light of the current authorities that exist for offices. So we heard earlier, my friend counsel for the Windsor Police Service, he asked you whether you're aware of the Project Hendon that was initiated by the OPP. And we know that through these proceedings, you've become aware of that project. As you can appreciate, and you spoke to this earlier, it seems clear to me that you understand that there's certain information that is held by law enforcement entities with their authorities and their protections for information that you understand you're not able to get directly because you are essentially a civilian office of government, right? We agree on that?
Yep.
So then would you also agree with me then, and perhaps we, you know, just to be direct, we're considering the role of the RCMP in this information chain. If there's an issue with the kind of information that you're getting from what is an existing project that the OPP's initiated, then that's something you could perhaps have a conversation with the RCMP about.
Absolutely. And so that's the range of optionality that we are looking at in terms of understanding what the gap is and how we're going to fill it. We don't have a solution yet. We know there's a gap. What is the best, most effective, most efficient way of filling it where we can have a broad view rather than a narrow view?
Right. And counsel for the Ottawa Police Service, he took you through some of, or with reference to some of the documents regarding the information that was available to government in those days leading up to the convoy. And so you recall reviewing that with him just a short while ago?
Yes.
Yes. You know, I do have a question for you. Were you made aware?
You're going to have to make it your last because you're over time. So
okay.
Go ahead. Pick your last question.
Okay, we'll make it the last question. Just on this matter of strategic review, have you had an opportunity? I'm going to refer to a document, OPP 1600. If we could pull it up very quickly, Mr. Clerk, just so that Ms. Thomas can take a look at it. And I don't expect you have seen this before because it is a Project Hendon report that was produced on January 13th. You can see it's entitled Strategic Intelligence Overview. So, you know, I'll put it to you, Ms. Thomas, that this overview is an example of the kind of big picture strategic review of intelligence without reference to individuals, talking about societal movements and how they manifest themselves. So would you agree with seeing this on its face? You can perhaps take a look at it on another occasion, but this is the kind of work that you're looking for to, you know, assist you in what you're hoping to do in your office.
This would be the kind of information we would receive along with other information and do a broad assessment of.
Okay, given that I'm out of time, we'll have to end our exchange here. Thank you very much for your time and have a good evening. And thank you, Commissioner, for allowing me a few extra moments.
Okay, thank you. Next is the Government of Canada, please.
Good evening, Ms. Thomas.
Good evening.
Donnery Nygaard for the Government of Canada. I want to start out by asking you about something one of my friends asked. The Council for OPS put to you that the convoy participants in Ottawa wanted just one thing to be heard. What was your understanding of what the convoy participants wanted?
They wanted all mandates removed. And they were going to stay in Ottawa until they were removed. And there was an element of the convoy that wanted the Prime Minister removed and a proxy government formed.
Thank you. We haven't spent any time today, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing your role coordinating the response of the federal government to the events that were occurring in Ottawa and across the country. So can you describe to the Commissioner what role you played there and what the federal government was doing in that regard?
Thank you. So as it has been said in my interview summary and in our institutional report, PCO has that central coordinating function for the Government of Canada on a number of issues, on just about every issue that goes through to Cabinet. We play a coordination function, we have a challenge function, and when there is a crisis, and this has been for as long as the position has existed, the NSIA on this kind of a crisis plays a lead role. much of the organization of meetings and documentation and briefing to ministers was organized by Jackie Bogdan, who's the new Deputy Secretary for Emergency Management at PCO. But what we did was bring colleagues together with their experts to discuss and try to understand how the federal government could assist in the resolution of not only the blockade here in Ottawa, but the various convoys that were occurring across the country. Because we've talked a lot about Ottawa today, but we haven't talked as much about the Ambassador Bridge. We certainly haven't talked about Coots, and then the continual pop-up convoys that were happening over this period in time. We used the forum of DMOC, which you have heard that acronym, to bring together the lead agencies, and we added additional departments. For example, the Deputy Minister of Justice joined us for many of our discussions, and because PCO was so very involved at every level in terms of the management of the national crises, I invited other deputy secretaries to come to DMOC, and certainly the clerk and the deputy clerk had a standing invitation. We wanted to have as broad a view as we could of what was going on and why it was happening, and how the federal government could use existing authorities and resources to respond. You've heard the discussion of the tow truck strategy. Well, that came out of discussions at DMOC. The work that Deputy Minister Stewart was leading on engagement, that came to DMOC for original discussion before it went to Cabinet. But that was where we brainstormed, aired ideas, and assigned tasks to various people and departments and PCO to follow up. Most of the work was tasked from DMOC down into ADM and SOPs, and they went off and engaged because ADMs are that engine that do that level of work. We briefed ministers almost daily, the core group of ministers. We did have formal cabinet meetings, as you've seen, the Safety, Security, and Emergency Management Committee, Canada and the World. We used Canada and the World because there was already a scheduled meeting to discuss Ukraine. The right group of ministers were there, so we briefed this as well. We had briefings to the Prime Minister, and then the IRG was invoked. And the full cabinet meetings leading up in between SSE, Canada and the World, and the IRG were also the vehicle to get information to the Prime Minister. We tried to be very methodical in how we tracked what was on the table to review, to pursue, to engage with provincial and municipal colleagues on, and that was the trackers that you've seen in the evidence that developed out of there. So I did not tell any deputy minister what they should do, nor what they should not do. We'd agree on courses of action, what ministers were going to be briefed, how we were going to engage ministers in the plans to try and use federal authorities and work with provincial authorities to resolve individual situations. But it is a coordination group where we talk, we discuss operational issues, and each department goes back and does their own thing and reports back in. And it's a relatively effective use of time and energy. And it became every day going through department by department. Yesterday you said this, what's changed? What are you doing tomorrow? Where are we?
And what were you telling the deputy minister community in those meetings about what their approach should be to looking at this issue?
Well, I would like to take credit, but it's the clerk of the Privy Council who actually told the community that when you're in the security environment, you get used to crises and you get used to protests and you get used to reading online threats, those kinds of things. She wanted us to think differently and think more broadly and to understand this situation, although it was acknowledged by the security deputy ministers, was unique in terms of its expanse across the country. But there was a thread across all of the incidents that said something, and that we needed to look at it from that perspective as well as the individual resolution of problems. Yes, the tow truck strategy as an example was very, very important, but there was a bigger, broader role for the federal government, and we needed to look at that.
And this was happening in DMOC, and at the same time, there were the SSEs at the beginning of the process that were continuous. What's the relationship between those two?
There isn't a relationship other than most of the deputy ministers at DMOC, their ministers are members of the SSE committee. And so there was a one-to-one briefing from the deputies to their ministers. The ministers would go and prepare to SSE.
So the work that was being done by the deputy minister community through DMOC to try and find solutions to this problem, when did that stop?
DMOC? It didn't stop.
So I guess the point I'm getting at, on the 10th of February, when it moved from SSE to the IRG and the track 1 and the track 2 was put in place, what was the deputy minister community working on at that point?
So it just, the moving to the IRG brought a focus from the Prime Minister, and it was very directive of what are you doing, Transport Canada, Minister Algabra, work with your provincial colleagues to achieve X, Y, and Z, and that became the tracker. So track 1 was anything we could do under existing legislation and with existing tools, and track 2 became what new could you use to help resolve this?
So when you moved to the track 1 and track 2, the deputy minister community was still working on the issues in track 1. What could you do to resolve with the existing authorities? Is that
absolutely
correct? And that continued on from February 10th until
revocation.
And you spoke to my friend for the city of Windsor about your discussion with Homeland Security in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
The Deputy Homeland Security, Deputy NSA for Homeland Security is Liz Sherwood-Randall. She reached out to me to say, we have a concern about the Ambassador Bridge. You've heard that concern from others. She said nothing different than what has already been heard. The president had been hearing from auto companies. He'd been hearing from governors. What was the situation? What could I tell her? And how could they help?
So fair to say that they were expressing considerable concern about the situation?
Absolutely concerned, but no pressure. They'd experienced their own protests. They knew they were complex. Could we learn from their experiences, and could we keep them informed? And as we were working through this, and if they could help in any way, they would.
Thank you. So when we get to the period of February 13th and 14th, and you've talked about your role in coordinating the information that's coming from the various intelligence communities within the federal government and pulling that all together to provide advice to the Prime Minister. In the period February 13th and 14th, what was your assessment of the situation that was going on across Canada at that point?
My assessment was that this was an entrenched movement, that the convoys were feeding off of each other, that they were causing significant economic instability, that the violent rhetoric was increasing rapidly and exponentially, that the number of threats against public figures were increasing, that we were seeing, I don't know if I've said this, seeing increased IMVE rhetoric that was concerning. Our concern on that front is not that any of the organizers of these various groups were going to take action themselves, but they were going to inspire a lone wolf. And our experience in Canada is that of the injuries and deaths that have been caused by ideologically motivated individuals, none of them have been known. They've all been inspired by online movements and rhetoric to do something and to act, and we had profound concern about that. Coutts was a point in time of huge concern because we'd been told there were weapons found in Coutts. I can't say that anybody was surprised there were weapons. We expected weapons to show up in various locations or anticipated that they could, but that it was of the magnitude that it was a significant concern. And the same language was being used in Ottawa. OPS said there were weapons in some of those rigs. Well, what did that mean? One person had a gun, or that there was another group similar to Coots? What we didn't know was as significant as what we did know. And we were at the point where we were going into the fourth weekend because we were through the third weekend without resolution. And in fact, it was growing. Ambassador Bridge, yes, moving towards being resolved, but until every single day that new convoys were being formed to take back the bridge, or they were going to take the Peace Bridge, or they were going to do both. That there were convoys coming from across the country to reinforce Ottawa. If that had become violent, and of course we're working on absolute information, and there is no intelligence that says tomorrow there's going to be an attack, but if it had become violent, knowing what we know now, there was not the police on the ground to manage it. And so you have to work in a world where you don't have absolutes and you have to use your best judgment on what to do. And what had to happen was it had to end.
And you've made clear, I think, in your earlier testimony that your view that the Section 2 CSIS Act definition, as applied by CSIS in the context of their particular mandate to investigate and collect information on individuals or groups, is very narrow. My understanding,
yes,
that's your position. And am I understanding what you said correctly in answer to my friend from JCCF's question about this in relation to these events, that your view is that it didn't meet the Section 2 CSIS Act definition as CSIS would apply it in their context?
That's correct.
You were asked by the Commission Council about whether your views were asked at the February 13th IRG regarding whether the Emergency Act should be invoked, and you said that you had indicated yes at that time. Can you tell us why?
For the reasons I described earlier, that if the powers existed in legislation, they were not being used or couldn't be used, and that we needed to take swift and decisive action to bring this national crisis to an end. We needed to compel tow trucks. We needed to have an exclusion zone so that people could no longer join the convoy. And the funding and the logistics chain that supported, particularly in Ottawa, but in other locations as well, the funding was significant, and so we needed to understand the money. And I know that Deputy Minister Sabia explained that earlier today. The combination of the tools that were put into the Emergency Act, time limited, as restrictive as possible, and as transparent as possible, was determined to be by the Governor and Council the most appropriate action to take at that moment in time to end what was going on across the country.
And finally, can you tell us a little bit about how mis and disinformation in the context of the convoy impacted on your decision-making and your advice and your assessments?
So mis and disinformation is a very hot topic. And everybody presumes that the mis and disinformation has to come from foreign sources and be foreign interference. And so there was a question that was discussed at one point about whether, Russia was fomenting the disinformation. The mis and disinformation, it could be said, is at the root of some of this problem of the convoy and the anger about vaccines and mandates and masks. The problem with it is that it occurs in the social media space, and threads pick up on each other and they generate more. And so if you believe misinformation, that's all you're going to see because you search for it and the algorithms feed it to you. We're actually working with social media companies to understand how the algorithms feed mis and disinformation and more significant terrorist information. That's come out of what happened in Christchurch, and it's quite well known, the Christchurch call. Misinformation means that people, and disinformation, have one source of information, and it continuously feeds upon each other. We heard misinformation during this hearing when somebody mentioned that they were not going to put DNA-altering medication in them. There is no DNA-altering medication, but it's believed. And so it made it very difficult to try and build a fact base for health officials, for police officials. There was misinformation during the convoy, for example, that the Prime Minister had signed a letter. He had not, but it circulated through the convoy here in Ottawa like wildfire. Absolutely incorrect, but it became fact for people, and it becomes fact very easily, and that sows some of the seeds of discontent that we have seen.
Thank you. Those are all of my questions.
Thank you. Any reply? No? Okay. For the record, there is none. And okay, well, that's, we want to thank you for coming and giving your evidence. You're free to go and enjoy what's left of the evening.
Thank you, sir.
And thank you for your evidence. So we're going to adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9:30. I expect it will be another long day, but it's Friday, so we can look forward to a weekend, some of us.
The commission is adjourned. La commission est adjournée.